Hey, how are you? Good, good. Everybody good? The committee will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. And we obviously have a distinguished guest here today who's going to help us through the dialogue. And our topic is the State Department's Fiscal Year 2020 budget request, and our witness is the right man to answer questions about that request, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. One thing many Americans may not realize is that the State Department is part of the bedrock of our national security. Its diplomats are our eyes and ears on the ground across the globe. These men and women are the tip of the spear for advancing U.S. interests overseas, our first line of defense against malign influences, and a vital lead in negotiations to make sure that our relations with friends and foes abroad don't go off the rails. The State Department's civil servants work every day to keep the U.S. economy strong, advocating for American exports that translate into jobs back home in states like mine, Idaho, where 24,000 jobs are supported by exporting just agricultural products alone. The State Department also provides billions of dollars to strategic allies like Israel to protect their security interests and help preserve peace around the world. As the old adage goes, the State Department is so indispensable, if it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. For all of these reasons and many more, I believe we need a vibrant State Department that takes care of our national interests and its own people who do a great job serving the American people. But we need a State Department for today, not for 2001, 1991, or 1975. The world has changed a lot over the past few decades, and we need our diplomacy to reflect that. For example, we need to make sure that our diplomats are getting the support they need to get outside the walls of our diplomatic posts to do their jobs. We all know that Chinese, Russian, and Iranian diplomats don't have trouble getting off their embassy compounds. In 2019, the stakes are too high to hamstring our national security in this way, which limits U.S. engagement in a number of places. We need our people out there working with our security partners, advancing human rights and the rule of law, and pushing our American business. These are things we simply cannot do well enough by sitting at a desk behind several layers of security in an embassy. On the State Department's budget, I recognize that like any federal agency, there are many areas for improvement, be it reducing redundancies or increasing efficiencies. I believe the department should find these efficiencies first and consider cuts second. I look forward to hearing Secretary Pompeo address these issues. First and foremost, though, the department needs to be fully staffed. We are far too into a presidential administration for there to be so many unfilled positions. How can we critique the performance of administration if it's not even allowed to field its own team? I'm optimistic that this week we will see confirmation of General Abbasad to be ambassador to Saudi Arabia, but there is much more work to be done, especially to fill a number of very important senior roles in the State Department here in Washington. And I know that the Secretary shares my view in that regard, as we've had several robust discussions regarding that. I want to thank Secretary Pompeo for appearing here today. I expect that this will be far from the last time we see him here this Congress. The easiest way to keep relations strong between the State Department and our committee is through open dialogue. Just like diplomacy, my hope is that the more we are talking, the less we are disagreeing. And so on a personal note, let me say, Secretary Pompeo, I've said publicly, and I'll say it again, you're the right man for the right job at this time. We sincerely appreciate that. Myself, like most other members of this committee, meet regularly with heads of state from the 200-plus countries and high-ranking officials there, and uniformly, you get high marks from those people as far as flying the flag and dealing with them. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for appearing here today. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary, back to the committee. We appreciate you being here. It is something of a cliche to say at hearings like this that we meet at a critical juncture or a consequential time for America in the world. But never in my nearly 3 decades of service in Congress have I seen a confluence of complicated challenges: Russia, China, North Korea, Afghanistan, climate change, rising authoritarianism, Saudi Arabia, migration crises in Central America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. None of these are easy, nor are they all of our making. But with all due respect, Mr. Secretary, thus far, the Trump administration has not demonstrated a deep understanding of or capacity required to meet these challenges. Confronting China is not the same thing as being competitive with China. Squandering alliances and alienating partners while cozying up to dictators is not prudent at precisely the time when we need like-minded, democratic, freedom-loving friends to confront a rising China, a revisionist Russia, or an emboldened Iran. Threatening to cut funding that supports the institutional capacity of our partners in Central America to deal with the root causes of migration, including grinding poverty and the violence of MS-13, is not an effective way to manage that challenge. Undermining unity at the World Trade Organization is a bizarre strategy at a time we should make it clear that China, not the United States, is the outlier in international economic architecture. Haranguing partners about the dangers of Huawei's 5G architecture, a concern that I share, is not a successful approach to develop a consortium of like-minded partners to develop a safe and cost-effective alternative. Failing to develop a diplomatic strategy to support peace in Mali or the Sahel more broadly, while jihadists and ethnic militia attacks have cost more than 2,000 lives in the last 5 months alone, leaves us vulnerable to global terrorism. And in Saudi Arabia, the administration's violation of the global Magnitsky Law, failing to respond to my request for a determination under the law as to the complicity of the Crown Prince, sends a global message to authoritarians that you can kill and violate human rights with impunity. So I'm disappointed to be having what I feel like is a recurring bad dream. This administration submits a budget request that demonstrates either no understanding of the value of U.S. diplomacy and foreign engagement, or has an active desire to see us retreat from the global stage and cede ground to our adversaries. I'm pleased that Congress, in exercising our constitutional prerogative as a separate and co-equal branch of government, has appropriated funds that we need to secure our interests and protect our citizens abroad. I agree with your national security strategy assessment that Russia poses a threat to democratic partners across Europe. Yet you propose cutting those funds to support democratic institution building. I applaud the administration's continuation of the Obama-era policy ISIS strategy, working with critical partners, that has led to the expulsion of ISIS from physical territory. And I'm pleased that at the urging of Congress and of allies, you seem to be willing to keep U.S. troops in place to help secure our interests. But as General Voltel warns, the fight is far from over. Yet your budget does not contain the sustained diplomatic and development resources we need to truly combat this evil. The world faces a truly existential crisis with climate change, and our own Defense Department continues to warn about the serious global implications of famine, migration, and conflict it may bear. Yet your budget seems to pretend that the problem does not even exist. Again, I agree with this administration's assessment that China presents new and evolving challenges across the Indo-Pacific and the world, challenges we must confront with a robust diplomatic and economic agenda. Your budget proposes a cut of close to 20% from the FY17 actual budget to meet our commitments in the Indo-Pacific. At your own department in Foggy Bottom, this administration's disdain for civil servants and the value of experienced professionals is weakening the foundational component of U.S. foreign policy, our diplomatic and development professionals. And I ask unanimous consent to enter to the record 2 columns by Ambassador Stephenson as to the hollowing out of the State Department.
They will be entered.
Finally, on the matter of oversight, I'd like to flag for your attention a classified matter that the committee had a briefing on yesterday, the details of which I won't and can't discuss here, where we raised with the Department an important issue that had not previously been shared with us, would not, in fact, have been shared with us had we not raised it with you, and may have made the difference in how senators voted on a particular matter. As I'm sure you appreciate, that's simply unacceptable. If the committee is to be able to function, if Congress is to play its constitutionally mandated role, the Department needs to do a better job of engaging with us, briefing us, and responding to our requests. Right now, the situation is not acceptable, and I'd be happy to discuss this further with you in a classified setting, as I'm sure many of my colleagues would. When you were confirmed as Secretary, I hope that you would be empowered and committed to promoting core American values and interests on the global stage. But we've seen the administration undermine our values with Saudi Arabia. We've seen maximum pressure on North Korea whittled away one tweet at a time. We've seen the administration pursue illogical, misogynistic policies to play domestic reproductive rights politics for political ambitions on the backs of the world's poorest women. So as I see it, the challenge for this committee is twofold: ensuring that Congress serves as a co-equal branch on government and check and power from the White House, and helping to inform the American people why that is important. Restoring the State Department and USAID budgets is a starting point, but we must be more effective in holding the administration accountable for its foreign policy shortcomings as well, and reminding the American people about the importance of core American values like democracy, governance, and human rights as drivers of our foreign policy. It is these fundamental values, along with America's unparalleled strengths on the global stage, a military second to none, a vital economy driven by innovation and technological ingenuity, a reservoir of goodwill with our allies and partners that provide us the opportunity to define a new role and a new grand strategy for the 21st century. I said earlier that I was skeptical of the administration's ability to be equal to this moment in world history. But, Mr. Secretary, I want you to prove me wrong. An opportunity remains to take hold of the moment before us, to face squarely the new challenges of this more competitive era, and to replenish our vision, reinvigorate our diplomacy, revive our partnerships, and to restore American leadership for a new era. And I look forward to the questions to pursue that view.
Thank you very much, Senator. And with that, we're going to hear from Secretary Pompeo. As a graduate of West Point and with your Harvard Law degree, you're certainly qualified for this job. But more importantly, as the ranking member referred to a classified briefing that we had yesterday, I think that time you spent as head of the CIA really uniquely qualifies you for this job. We on this committee, I've got the advantage of being on both committees, and there's only two of us, Senator Rubio and I, that are in that position. And we had a stark reminder yesterday of the tremendous amount of information that's out there in the classified setting that we can't talk about at hearings like this. But Senator Menendez is correct that there are items that we need a closer bond on. This isn't your fault. It's the way that the system works here, where we have a separate Foreign Relations and Intelligence Committee, and the volume of what we deal with in Intel is just, as you know, is just staggering, and it affects what we do here. So anyway, probably as much as we can talk about here. But with that, Secretary Pompeo, the floor is yours, and a warm welcome.
Chairman Risch, thank you. Senator Menendez, Ranking Member, thank you, sir. In my testimony yesterday to the Appropriations Committee, I took a few moments to describe the administration's greatest foreign policy challenges, what we've done to solve them, how we've benefited the American people by doing so. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about that same set of issues here with you all this morning. When we took office, we inherited the most complex set of threats that the United States of America has faced since World War II. We faced a China that was turning towards authoritarianism, turning away from market liberalization, and turning the screws on its minority populations in a truly Orwellian fashion. We faced an Iranian regime that, flush with cash from the nuclear deal, set about seeding terror from Yemen to Syria to Lebanon and beyond. We faced a Russia that felt no compunction about invading Ukraine, seizing Crimea, meddling in our elections, and breaking arms control treaties. We faced a North Korea that continued to pursue its nuclear and missile proliferation threats to our nation. And we faced a terror threat that was more deadly and stretched across a far wider geography. What did we do? First, the Trump administration recognized and faced reality. We know we can't make sound policy based on wishful thinking. We can't lead from behind. We leveled with the American people and our friends and partners about the threats that we face individually and collectively. This honesty produced growing bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill about the need to confront Chinese aggression. It produced unanimous consensus inside of NATO that arms control agreements like the INF Treaty are worthless if only one party adheres to their terms. It produced international support for the brave people of Venezuela. Basing policy on reality, we recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. We recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. It's why the State Department designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terror organization on Monday. It's just a simple recognition of reality. Second, we use creative diplomacy to build coalitions to confront our enemies. We know we can't nor should we do everything ourselves. We convinced our NATO allies to spend more on their own defense. We rallied the Defeat ISIS coalition to dismantle the caliphate in Iraq and Syria. We convened over 60 countries in Warsaw to discuss common threats and shared opportunities in the Middle East, and that included both Arab and Israeli leaders talking to each other. We're getting our Middle East Strategic Alliance off the ground, and we have built out an Indo-Pacific strategy to do a true pivot to Asia. We've supported our hemispheric partners in the OAS and the Lima Group as they work to support the Venezuelan people, and we've forged a global coalition at the United Nations to impose the toughest ever sanctions on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So what did we get? Third, what are the outcomes? This administration promised to dismantle the caliphate, and we've done it. We promised to confront China for its unfair trade practices and call them out on human rights violations. We've done that too. We promised to exit the Iran nuclear deal to exert pressure on Tehran to change its murderous ways. Still more work to do. We're working every day to protect our citizens at home and abroad, advance American prosperity and values, and support our allies and partners overseas. Finally, one point. Each of you, too, in your opening remarks alluded to this. When I became Secretary of State, I promised I would put diplomacy at the forefront of defending U.S. national security, to give state its swagger back. I think we've made a lot of progress. Here's what we've done. It's been 11 months and a couple of weeks now. I lifted the hiring freeze, both on our team and employee family members. This was a no-brainer, taking 2,000 talented people and putting them back in the workforce. We reinstituted promotion rates for the foreign services. We'll have more foreign service officers by the end of this calendar year than ever in the history of the United States of America. The notion that we've been hollowed out is simply not factually based. New foreign service officer and foreign service specialist classes are being admitted. 55 senior leaders have been conferred by the Senate. I appreciate that. I hold small group events, both when I'm traveling at embassies. I do it in Washington and other places where State Department has officials. We call them Meet with Mike, where I hear directly from our team. And more importantly, I get to hear the things that we're doing well and the things that they wish we were doing still better. I've learned a great deal from these professionals. Back in the States, I've traveled a bit, traveling around the country talking about the importance of diplomacy in America and frankly doing some recruiting work as well to make sure we have America's finest joining our team. At my recommendation, President Trump and the Senate recognized 4 individuals with the rank of career ambassador: David Hale, Phil Goldberg, Michelle Sassans, Dan Smith, who leads our Foreign Service Institute. The rest of our team knows that they can look up to these true diplomatic professionals. I have a lot more to say, but I'll end there. I look forward to discussing the administration's foreign policy and the $40 billion budget request for the State Department and USAID for fiscal year 2020. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. We appreciate that. I'm going to reserve questioning as we go down the pike, and so I will first yield to Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, the administration's recent decision to cut all U.S. aid to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras appears to me to stand out as a self-inflicted wound to our national security and our national interests. Just 6 months ago, Vice President Pence said that the United States, quote, has never been more committed to strengthening our partnership with the nations in the Northern Triangle, close quote, and to address the drug trafficking gangs and criminal violence forcing people to flee their countries. He said, quote, we must confront them at their source within the Northern Triangle. So let me ask you a few basic yes or no questions. Do you believe that U.S. foreign assistance advances our national security?
Are you speaking about in the Northern Triangle countries and its effectiveness, or are you speaking broadly as foreign?
Let's start broadly.
Yes, sir. If done properly, done effectively, it certainly can.
Do you believe that it is in the U.S. national interest to work with countries around the globe to combat drug trafficking and transnational criminal organizations?
To do this effectively, we need partners all around the world. Yes, Senator.
Do you believe that U.S. national security is advanced by terminating funding for law enforcement cooperation with Central American countries?
If I may explain the decision that we've made and why the President made that decision, it begins with the fact that there's an enormous crisis at our southern border. The United States has spent hundreds of millions of dollars to try and build out solutions, foreign assistance dollars, to try and build out solutions in these three countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. You can see, it's a fact of this crisis at the southern border, that it has not been effective. And so we are endeavoring to change that, right? We deal in reality. It's not enough to take taxpayer money and spend it there. You need to get something for that. And that's what we are engaged in now. We're having conversations with the leadership in those countries. We want better lives for those people. But most importantly, we want to make sure that every dollar, taxpayer dollar we spend in the Northern Triangle is effectively used.
We certainly want every taxpayer dollar spent anywhere in the world to be effective. But to believe that longstanding challenges, I think the Vice President had it right only 6 months ago when he made the statements that he made. U.S. national security is not advanced by terminating funding for law enforcement cooperation with Central American countries. U.S. national interests are not advanced by terminating funding for programs that strengthen the rule of law. Why are people fleeing? They're fleeing because of violent crime. Their choice is stay or die, or flee and have a chance at living, or stay and see my daughter raped, or stay and see my son forcibly put into a gang. We need to fight at the very essence of that. And the very essence of that is not at our border, it's in Central America. I don't understand how the USAID programs that stabilize Central American countries by promoting economic development and helping people find opportunities in their own countries. I think the administration had it right, and that Congress is urging, when you were involved with Central America and trying to get to the root causes. All this will do is create greater instability in the region and will drive more people in fear and in hopelessness to the border, and we will exacerbate the situation. So I really urge you to recalibrate that, because it's just a fundamentally wrong policy. Let me switch to something we do agree on, Venezuela. And along with Senator Rubio and 10 members of this committee, we have introduced legislation last week reinforcing several elements of the administration's strategy and dramatically expanding our humanitarian response with $400 million in new aid. But I have two questions in this regard. Number one, what is the department doing to internationalize our sanctions and try to get the European, Canadians, and Latin American partners to join us? And why haven't we convened an international donor summit, and will you consider doing that?
The second one, we will absolutely consider it. We'll see who the right leader for that should be to actually convene that. It is absolutely a central part of the day that we're successful there at supporting the Venezuelan people to achieve democracy in the way they so richly deserve, that there'll be resources required, and I'm confident we will find partners all around the world that will be part of that, and a donors conference will be an element of effectuating that. Your first question was, we are working with some 50-plus nations now that have recognized the new government, the leadership under Juan Guaido, to sanction in the same way that we have. We're continuing to push. We've demarched countries all across the world. We're trying to bring more to the coalition of 54, and we're trying to get those 54 to impose sanctions that match the ones that the United States has imposed.
That's critical. Last question. January marked the one-year anniversary of landmark agreements between the U.S. and Qatar regarding government subsidies to Qatar Airways, the state-owned airline. In addition to committing to financial transparency, in a side letter to the agreement, the Qatari government indicated that there was no intention to launch additional Fifth Freedom flights launched from Qatar but picking up passengers in Europe before flying to U.S. destinations. Yet at the same time as the agreement was being negotiated, Qatar Airways acquired a 49% stake in Air Italy, a formerly struggling regional Italian carrier, and rebranded it as an international carrier with flights to 5 U.S. destinations from Milan. That runs directly counter to the one-year agreement. Are you aware of this, and if so, what efforts are underway to enforce the agreements that are in place?
Yes, Senator, I'm personally aware that I have personally engaged on this issue, and we are working to make sure that every party to those agreements complies with every element of those agreements. In fact, I will engage again tomorrow with several of the parties that are in this. The entire United States government sees what's going on, and we're working to put this agreement. We think it was a good agreement. We're trying to just make sure that it's enforced.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And lest people think that we're totally divided on things, those last two issues is, this committee is, I think, uniformly in favor of the discrimination against our carriers that's taken place by the Middle East carriers. And then secondly, the support of the Juan Guaido administration, the true president of Venezuela, is so important to all of us, and we sincerely appreciate the administration's efforts in that regard, and we'll support it 100%. With that, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service.
Yes, sir.
Last Monday, I met with Brian Bulatao, the nominee for Undersecretary of Management. Now, first of all, that's the second time I've met with him. Normally, this process works. I meet with the nominee. We go through the confirmation process. The nominee gets confirmed, and we just start talking to those people in hearings like this. So the fact that such a qualified individual, West Point graduate, somebody who's served in a lead management role in the private sector, most recently chief operating officer of the CIA, has been languishing as a nominee for 9 months, I think is a disgrace. Particularly when you have Senator Menendez talking about the hollowing out of the State Department, which you have, I think, rightly disputed. Can you just speak to how crucial it is to get Mr. Bulatalo confirmed as basically the Chief Operating Officer, the Undersecretary of Management for the State Department, so you can carry out your vital mission?
So full disclosure, I've known Brian for 35 plus years. Tell you how old I am. But more importantly, we haven't had an Undersecretary for Management, essentially the Chief Operating Officer at the State Department, for 2 years now. The gentleman who's filling that role, Bill Todd, is a great officer, a great civil servant, but we need the confirmed leadership in that position to execute all of the security issues, all of the administrative issues. Just the enormous bureaucracy of 92,000 people to administer falls under the Undersecretary for Management, and the absence of having someone confirmed to that position has made each of those tasks more difficult.
Are you aware of any legitimate reason for holding this nomination up other than just pure partisan politics?
I'm not aware of anything that relates directly to Mr. Bulato's qualifications.
Okay, well, again, I urge this committee, I urge the Senate to quickly confirm Mr. Bulatalo. I also want to pick up on the whole situation with the Northern Triangle, our humanitarian crisis at the border. 2014, we had 120,000 unaccompanied children and people's family units. President Obama correctly called that a humanitarian crisis. The first 6 months of this year, we're already over 240,000, primarily people now coming in as family units. And I will dispute what Senator Menendez said. There's no doubt that people are fleeing some violence, but there's also no doubt an awful lot of those individuals are coming here for economic opportunity, family reunification, which I'm highly sympathetic with, but it's not a valid asylum claim. The truth is, 85% of those asylum claims are denied. We have, as you pointed out, we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars of development down there, but until we crush the drug cartels, I don't see the development dollars doing a whole lot of good, and it's certainly going to do nothing to solve this problem in the here and now of individuals coming here completely exploiting U.S. laws. The ball is in Congress's court. We have to act. We have to change these laws to first and foremost, reduce, if not stop, that flow of illegal immigration, the majority of which really is economic migration and family reunification. In your former capacity and your current capacity, can you just talk about, I've met with the Mexican ambassador twice, the new administration. I think they are genuinely interested in working with us to solve this problem. But they were talking about development dollars, and I understand that. That is a long-term solution, but we are whistling by the graveyard if we don't address and talk about an effective strategy for crushing the drug cartels. Can you just talk about how difficult that is, what the challenge that presents to America?
Senator Johnson, this has been it's a long-time challenge. We've had times when we've made more progress, and then it has gotten worse or regressed. The complexity, the money, these are powerful organizations inside of Mexico with huge incentives to continue to deliver these drugs, whether that's cocaine or opioids, into our country. It's an incredibly lucrative undertaking, and so every element of American power needs to be deployed to take them down. And then we need partners, partners like the Mexican government, partners like the country in the Central America. We need China to do what President Xi committed he would do on fentanyl. It's going to take a combined effort, lots of streams, lots of work streams to pull it off. But the risk that it presents to America is enormous. It's an important foreign policy problem, often masquerading as a law enforcement problem. We're deeply engaged. Foreign Minister Ebrard has been a good partner so far in his time in leadership in the Mexican government. I'm convinced they want to help us. We need to help them do it.
This is going to require a multinational effort. One thing we found out in a hearing just this week and last week as well is the southern border is totally controlled on the southern side of the border by the drug and the human trafficking cartels. Nobody passes virtually without paying the fee. So this is a highly organized effort, exploiting our laws, and we are going to need, through all diplomacy, and I think that's what this administration is trying to do, get the attention of Central American nations and Mexico. We need your help to solve this problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Johnson. And next we'll have Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your service, and thank you very much for being here. This is a hearing to review the budget for FY20, and budget speaks to priorities. So I want to start to give you a chance to respond to the visual concern that a 30% cut in the State Department budget looks like we are cutting back diplomacy as a tool by 30%. But I want to get to your statement about promoting American values that you just mentioned. Democracy programs are reduced by almost 50% in this budget. In July, there was a conference in Copenhagen that pointed out that we've seen a decline in democratic states around the world. And we know that we're being attacked on democratic institutions by both Russia and China and other actors. So what are we doing to promote democracy with such a dramatic reduction in the tools that are available in the State Department if the FY20 budget became real? Before you respond, I would also say one of the real opportunities to promote American values of democracy, governance, human rights, and anti-corruption are on the bilateral and multilateral meetings that we have. And yet, there's been silence in regards to North Korea, Kim Jong-un's treatment of his own people being the worst human rights record of any country in the world. And we still have not gotten a response to a full accounting of what happened in Saudi Arabia on the tragic death of Jamal Khashoggi. So can you just explain to me how you are promoting American values of democracy, good governance, human rights, anti-corruption, in light of the fact that the budget cuts this and we have not seen the visibility during highly important moments with other countries, these issues being raised?
So I would just disagree with about everything you opened with in your
question. Budget, 30% cut?
This administration has been incredibly active, but more importantly, incredibly effective at promoting democracy around the world. We're engaged. You mentioned a couple particular items. Happy to talk about those in great detail if you like, but our engagement, building out coalitions around the world, part of democracy promotion, right? You don't think about the work to defeat ISIS as an element of that, right? To create the political stability inside of Syria so that we can get a political resolution there. The work that we're doing in Venezuela, the fact that we're fighting for the people of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and at forums all across the world, my team is in the field working to promote the very values that you just described.
Well, the facts are the facts. The budget submissions are the budget submissions. Let me go to the Northern Triangle for one moment in response to the last questions. Our involvement in the Northern Triangle is critically important for many reasons. But these are countries that have significant problems with corruption. And the United States has participated with the international community to try to root out the corruption in the Northern Triangle. Are you committed to working with this committee? We are looking at additional legislation to give additional tools in regards to identifying corruption issues so that in our bilateral and regional relationships, the issues of fighting corruption will be front and center in these debates. Do you agree with that approach?
I do. Yes, Senator.
I appreciate that. And we'll have some legislation, as I talked to you earlier, that we'd like to work with you on. I want to talk a little bit about North Korea, if I might. We've had two summits between the leader of North Korea and the United States. Have we reached an agreement of what the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula would look like?
I can't answer that question yes or no. We have had extensive conversations with the North Korean about what the full final denuclearization, as verified by the international community, would ultimately look like. It would look like the fully denuclearized North Korea.
Has
That's what it would look like.
Has Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, agreed on that assessment on the what the denuclearization would be involved?
Yes, he said it. He's made the commitment to me more than
And
half a dozen times.
he
He has made the commitment to the President of the United States, and it's in writing.
Has he given you a declaration as to their current nuclear programs and a way in which they would move from their current nuclear programs to total denuclearization?
There's still a great deal of work to do to achieve the ultimate goal.
Right. And of course, we've had hearings before this committee that indicate that that's really the first step on denuclearization, is understanding their program, having a commitment to end it, and a roadmap that can lead to that commitment. That's usually the preliminaries. We now have had 2 summit meetings, and we don't yet have that in place.
Senator, I wish we'd have gotten that from the Iranians.
I do believe we have a
It was a total fraud, Senator, and everyone knew it. The declaration the Iranians made was completely fraught with errors, both of intentional and otherwise. We're working. We understand that you need a baseline to begin to denuclearize North Korea, and we're determined to get there.
I appreciate your pivot to my question.
Well, I answered your question. We've still got work to do, Senator.
I understand that, and I'm trying to focus on North Korea. In Iran, there are boots on the ground. We have people, not us. The international community have inspectors that are looking at sites. Do we have international inspectors in North Korea?
We do not.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's an honor to see you. Appreciate your service to our country. You're a man of extraordinary capacity, having worked in the private sector, having served in the CIA as well as other parts of the public sector, and of course having gone to the best law school in the world. And so I appreciate your capacity to consider the kind of challenges we have. It is no surprise to anyone that China has ambition to dominate the world economically, militarily, geopolitically, and it would be a very, very different world indeed if they had the capacity and the ability to do that. I applaud the fact that the administration is taking action to push back against some of China's plans, specifically the imbalance of trade, the theft of intellectual property, and the forced transfer of technology as companies are considering moving into the Chinese market. But I wonder whether we're really addressing and confronting in a holistic strategy the various initiatives that China is undertaking. And there are some that I don't know whether we have plans afoot to deal with them piece by piece or whether we need something more expansive, but some kind of mind. One is, of course, the fact that China has, if you will, an industrial policy-oriented form of free enterprise, where they subsidize massively industries of the future, and whether that's 5G or telecommunication systems or artificial intelligence. So we welcome them into a world where we say we believe in free markets, and yet they participate in an unfree way, and that presents a challenge. They also are reported to buy American and other Western companies, small companies that have good technology, steal that technology and take it back to their more domestic purposes. They have a very extensive propaganda program in our country and throughout the West. The Confucius Institutes are clearly a part of that, and yet we have high schools, elementary schools, and universities in our country that don't seem to understand that by accepting the Confucius Institute, that they're participating in Chinese propaganda in our own country. Of course, there is the extraordinary oppression of human beings that we're seeing with the Uyghur in their own country, and then there's their ambition in the South China Sea, which is obviously challenging in its own right. So my question is: do we have a robust strategy to counter the entire Chinese effort, and particularly on those items that I've mentioned? Are we considering those, or do we need to take a deeper dive into how to really confront what is, in my view, the great threat of this century, which is an authoritarian regime bent on dominating the world, which would be bad for free enterprise, for freedom, and for the prosperity of America and the world?
Senator, it's an important question, maybe the most important question that I'll get asked today. I think the world was slow to recognize the challenge that China has begun to present. I think we are now much further along the way than we were just 2 years ago. First step is always to recognize the challenge you have in front of you, and then second, to chart a course to confront each of those various challenges. You talked about a challenge from the Orwellian nature of the absence of human rights inside of China. You talked about it's not just Uyghurs, it's Kazakhs, it's Christians, it's broader than that. If you've seen these stories of this app that's being used, it's the Little Red Book, Mao's Little Red Book brought to your iPhone, where they have people put in their phone numbers and their names, and they get points for answering questions about Xi's policies. It's really quite something. The military is on the advance. You've seen it in the technology space. The State Department has a role in each of those. Obviously, other agencies have a bigger part in some of them. But our effort has been broad. First, to let the world know of these challenges. So our team across 180-plus embassies is out talking to our partners, sharing with them the risks, identifying the information we have so that they'll begin to take this challenge seriously. With respect to predatory lending and forced technology transfer, we're telling these countries about what will happen to them. It may feel good for a year or 2 years when you get that new project, but the legacy, the overhang will be enormously bad for the people of your country. And then there's a significant undertaking, more broad than the State Department inside the United States government, to make sure that these technology challenges, making sure that America remains in the front on AI, in front on the next wireless wave 5G, blockchain, all the issues that will dominate commerce and the rule of law in the decades ahead, that the United States is positioned properly. We confront an enormously difficult challenge. They take their big companies and make them subservient to their government. We don't roll that way. We shouldn't roll that way. But I believe ultimately we'll prevail with the rule of law, transparency, as long as we're serious and focused on this set of issues.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Romney. I agree with almost everything you said, except I know there's at least three members who are graduate, or three people in this room who are graduates of the University of Idaho College of Law that would take exception regarding the law school.
Didn't get into Harvard, did they?
They did not. Didn't apply. Thank you so much. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary, we had a hearing in the Armed Services Committee about 10 days ago with Secretary Perry, who is in on an annual to talk about the DOE's programs that support the military, primarily nuclear reactors. And I asked him about news that had broken just within about a day of the hearing about Part 810 authorizations that I think are in his bailiwick, where he would authorize transfer of nuclear know-how, not technology, but nuclear know-how from American companies to foreign nations. He indicated during the hearing that he had signed 7 such approvals, authorizations for transfers of technology to Saudi Arabia. My understanding is the Part 810 process requires that there be a State Department sign-off on that. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct. We're aware of these Part 810 issues.
He had kept these private in a way that was counter to earlier practice, where the authorizations, at least the fact of the authorizations, had been made public. He described it as necessary to protect proprietary information. I asked him, well, you could keep the proprietary information private, but what about the fact of the authorizations? Did the State Department have to sign off on the DOE keeping the fact of these authorizations private?
Senator, I don't know the answer to that, but I will get you an answer on whether we signed off on the decision not to release that information, or if we were involved, or more broadly, if we were involved in that decision.
That would be helpful. I'll follow up with that. And then finally, I also asked him about the date of the authorizations. The 7 occurred from Inauguration Day 2017, but I asked if he knew anything about the dates. Do you know whether any of the authorizations occurred after October 2, 2018?
I do not.
I
don't know. I'm sorry, Senator. Yeah.
I will follow up with that as well. Another question on Saudi Arabia. I'm just referring to an article in the National Interest dated September 22, 2018, which references earlier reporting by Newsweek. The story that I'm looking at and that I'd like to introduce for the record, if I might, Mr. Chair, is titled, "Saudi Arabia already has a ballistic missile arsenal courtesy of China with a little help from the CIA." And it's a summary of Saudi purchases of ballistic missiles from China beginning in the 1980s. There was a set of purchases in the 80s, and then there's also reporting about purchases that were done, I think, in the 2007-2008 timeframe that the CIA helped broker. The reporting by Newsweek was done in 2014, and then the assessment by the national interest about the scope of the Saudi ballistic missile program, including purchase of missiles from China. This piece was written in September. There's a lot of issues with Saudi Arabia right now. We're grappling with Yemen. We're grappling with human rights concerns. We're grappling with these Part 10, 810 authorizations. We're trying to get more information about that. What should this committee, or what concern should this committee have about the development of ballistic missile programs in Saudi Arabia? The national interest article suggests that the missiles are arrayed pointed at both Iran and Israel. That's in the national interest piece that I've introduced. What concern should we have about the development of a Saudi ballistic missile program, and particularly the acquiring of missile technology from nations like China?
So two thoughts. We should absolutely be interested in that. We should know the fact that they're purchasing it from China. I think there have been those who have urged the United States to take a different posture with respect to Saudi Arabia, not to sell them technology. I think you see the risks that are created. It would be better if the United States was involved in those transactions than if China was. I can't comment. I've seen that reporting publicly as well. I can't say much about it here. I'm confident the Intelligence Committee can give you a full briefing with respect to this. But missiles in the Middle East is an increasing threat. Frankly, missiles more broadly throughout the world continue to be an increasing risk. The technology has gotten cheaper. The information is now much more widespread, so capabilities are growing in lots of countries, some of which are friendly partner countries today, but may not be 5, 10, 20 years from now, and some of which are adversaries even today. These threats of, we think about nuclear proliferation, threats of missile proliferation are very real as well, and it's something this committee should absolutely be looking into.
So nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, missile proliferation in the Middle East, these are things that this committee and other committees need to take very seriously.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
I yield back the rest of my time. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Isaacson.
I want to commend the chairman and the ranking member on their statements about the Qatar situation with our airlines, and I'd like to ask Secretary, as I understand in the agreement on Open Skies agreement, there is a provision where one of the parties, including us, could call for what's known as formal consultations if there are concerns over the good behavior of both parties on that airline. Would you get us into a situation where we could call for those consultations? Are we at the point where we need to have consultations with Qatar?
Senator, I don't know if we're quite there yet. There are lots of consultations taking place, not through the mechanism that you're describing. It may be that that's ultimately be required. You know the history of this challenge. We thought we had put together a truly good deal that was good for U.S. domestic businesses, that honored the commitments that had been made previously. We thought we were in a very good place. We're looking very closely at this recent decision by Qatar to take on 49% of this airline. We understand the risk of the efforts to circumvent, and we're working to make sure everyone's complying with the agreement that they'd entered into.
Well, I appreciate that attention because it is very important, and it's important to many, many Georgians, but the entire aviation industry, both manufacturing aviation as well as providing flights in the United States, and I would appreciate you doing all you can.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate what you're doing already. And I want to say thank you tremendously for a meeting with some of the hostages who survived the Iran hostage crisis a number of years ago now. In fact, there's still a number of those people alive, although some of them have passed, and some of them are in conditions that are not at all conducive to living a normal life, much less a happy life. And as their time runs out, so does the opportunity for them to collect on the rewards that were made to them from the funds that were available. As a matter of fact, the first release they got about 14% of what was owed to them in total. The last release, that went from 14% to 4%, not because they reduced the amount of money from the fund that they took out, but because 3,000 other people were added to the fund in the special matters choice to give that money out. And I'm really worried about them ending up not getting what they should have gotten. These people went through probably as bad a torture, as bad a treatment as any American ever did. It was the formation of the Nightline TV show with 444 nights all of America saw was happening to them. So I'm really concerned about them, and I want to do everything we can to see to it they get their money and they're spoken for. Have you talked with Attorney General Barr about their situation?
I've not had a chance to do that yet. It's an important issue. 52 hostages, 444 days. Frankly, held by some of the same people who are leading the Islamic Republic of Iran today, beaten by those very same human beings. I'm aware of the situation with respect to them getting the money that they deserve, and I will have a conversation with Attorney General Barr. I've not had a chance to do that yet.
I would really appreciate it if you would. I think about it every day. Colonel Scott from Georgia, Stone Mountain, Georgia, was one of those victims. Mm-hmm. He's a wonderful man. He's aging, as all of us are, and I would love to see the families get the money that was intended to go to them, Lastly, I want to talk about New START for just a second. I supported the START Treaty 4 or 5 years ago when we ratified and extended it. I know it comes up in 2 years, I think, for renegotiation. I think there are preliminary talks going on. Am I not correct?
That's correct, yes, sir.
A lot of people, some of those nuclear treaties have been canceled in recent years, and there's some people that have misperceptions of different nuclear agreements like IMF and other things like that. The thing I liked about the START Treaty, and the reason I spoke for it and worked with Secretary Kerry to get the votes to pass it, was because it had a unique identifier system which we never had available to us before the Russians, so we could more accurately count their weapons, not just call them to be counted. We had a way of counting. Second, we had the no-notice inspection provisions where we could have Russians would be in the United States and would have access to our facilities, and we put Americans in Russia to have access to theirs. So having that kind of elevated accountability was good to me, was something I thought was good for the country. What stage are we on New START? Are we going in the right direction, and do you think New START has served us well so far?
So New START, different than the INF Treaty, there is large compliance with the New START agreement on both sides. There are some arguments on the edges each, but largely they've been compliant. Both the Russians and the United States have been compliant. We're at the very beginning of conversations about renewing that. If we can get the deal right, if we can make sure that it fits 2021 and beyond, President Trump has made very clear that if we can get a good, solid arms control agreement, we ought to get one. And we're at the start of having those conversations.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for the great work you're doing for the country.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator. I agree with you. That New START's going to be very important to us, and we're living in a different world than when the original START Treaty was put together, and there's going to have to be accommodations for that for other powers in the world that aren't a member of the treaty. So thank you. With that, Senator Merkley.
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, you said that the renewal depends on fitting 2021 and beyond. What are the 2 or 3 key things that you think need to be addressed to make the New START fit 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, it's a good question, Senator. So technology has moved. The central ideas of strategic deterrence that underpin the New START deal, we need to make sure still fit the various technologies that exist today. Some may be more important. The nuclear triad, it may be different. We've got to make sure it fits so there's true deterrence continues to extend. We have to make sure that the verification regime fits technology today, the world as it moves forward. And then finally, we need to make sure that we've got all of the parties that are relevant as a component of this as well. Those are all tough challenges. They're all difficult.
By all the parties, are you referring to other countries?
Yes, other countries besides the United States and Russia. And it may be that we can't get there. It may be that it just we end up working with the Russians on this. But if we're talking about a nuclear capacity, nuclear capability that presents risk to the United States, it's very different today in the world than it was when that.
It sounds like you're referring to China.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Certainly, with respect to missiles for other treaties, it's certainly China that has large numbers.
Well, let me pivot to China then. The Uyghur Muslims are being enslaved in re-education camps, industrial production, being taken off the streets. Some villages basically have no men left yet. There is a Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. I believe Marco Rubio is the lead on it, but it's bipartisan. Do you support Congress taking a strong stand, America taking a strong stand in regard to this persecution of the Uyghurs?
I do.
Thank you. So China has taken the proceeds from the imbalance in trade, and they have brought their infrastructure from bicycles to bullet trains in about 25 years. I was on the first bullet train out of Beijing. They now have 16,000 miles of levitated magnetic bullet trains running over 200 miles. We have 0 miles. They are buying up foreign minerals around the world. They are doing prestige projects to expand their influence in country after country. They're engaged in debt diplomacy so that those projects can actually lead to huge leverage going forward, like the port that they've taken control of in Sri Lanka. They are doing an inside deal in El Salvador where they are attempting to buy a huge chunk of the southern coastline in El Salvador to extend their influence in Central America. They are on the move in a comprehensive Belt and Road strategy. While we're sitting here, our infrastructure has been basically the same the last 25 years. I'm very concerned that we are slipping behind. What are we going to do about it?
Well, Senator, with respect to U.S. domestic infrastructure, it's a bit out of my lane as Secretary of State. In terms of pushing back against the Chinese, I laid out, I think it was in response to a question from Senator Romney, the various work streams that we're engaged in. I'm happy to walk through them, whether it's the Build Act, the DFC, our diplomatic efforts with ASEAN at the very center of how we build out a coalition. And on the technology side, there is a all of the United States government effort to make sure that U.S. Companies and, frankly, non-U.S. companies, non-Chinese companies have an opportunity to continue to compete on a transparent basis where we can ensure that we don't have Chinese values, Chinese systems controlling our information space 10, 15, 20 years from now.
I think that a lot of members of the committee, bipartisan way, have a lot of concerns that China has a comprehensive strategy that's implementing. It is connected to international affairs because the proceeds that drive the Chinese policy come from their trade relationship with the United States. Let's turn to North Korea. I think of the challenge with their nuclear program as kind of like a baseball game, and first base is a freeze on their missile tests and their warhead explosions, which is where we are right now. Second base is a full inventory of their nuclear assets. Third is an agreement on how to wipe those out or eliminate them. And fourth is an extensive implemented verification regime. We're stuck on first base. How are we going to get off first base?
Senator, we have the largest coalition and the strongest sanctions and sanctions enforcement in history on North Korea. It's what has created this opportunity for diplomacy. We've not moved as far, but I think we always knew this would be a long discussion. We're not stuck on first base. I think that analogy is not accurate. There remains an awful lot of work to do, but we have moved to where, as you described, there aren't missile tests today. There aren't nuclear explosions going on in North Korea today. Our diplomatic team is engaged in painting the picture, trying to convince Chairman Kim that there is a path forward that will make a brighter future for the North Korean people and reduce the risk. We've got Japan, we have South Korea, we engage with the Russians and the Chinese. It is a broad effort to lead a diplomatic undertaking to convince Chairman Kim to deliver on what he promised President Trump he would do in Singapore in June of last year.
Thank you. My time is up, but I'll just summarize by saying the economic sanctions are weakening. The North Koreans are finding many more ways around them. They have proceeded to develop their missile program even while they have frozen their ballistic missile testing and their warheads. So we're not even completely safe on first base. Thank you.
Senator Pompeo, did you want to respond to that last comment?
No, only that it's always important to remember initial conditions. When we came in January of 2017, there was nothing going on. We're in a far better place today than we were 2 years ago, both from a sanctions regime and a diplomatic. That's quite an accomplishment. They sometimes don't go together, sanctions to deter diplomacy. In this case, we've achieved both.
Senator Paul.
Thank you for your testimony, Secretary Pompeo. Do you believe that the 2001 authorization to go to war with those who attacked us on 9/11 applies to Iran or Iran's Revolutionary Guard?
I'd prefer to just leave that to lawyers, Senator.
Well, I would think it would be a pretty important question that whether or not you think you have the right to invade or declare war or engage in war with Iran. It doesn't sound like something we're going to leave to the Supreme Court. It's going to be a decision by the administration.
Right.
Does the administration believe you've just recently classified, the entire Revolutionary Guard as terrorist? Do you think that somehow includes them in the 2001, and is that any part of the decision-making process with including this designation?
I'll answer your second question. It was not part of the decision-making process. The designation was a simple recognition of reality These are terrorists. They killed 600 Americans. 600 Americans dead, families today grieving. We recognize them as terrorists in the same way we do other terrorist groups around the world. When we see them, we try to call them out as best we can and as quickly as we can.
But you're unwilling to state unequivocally that that the resolution in 2001 to have retribution and stop the people who attacked us, that Iran had something to do with the attacks on 9/11, or that the National Iraqi, Revolutionary Guard had something to do with 9/11.
Yeah. So you asked a factual question and a legal question there. The legal question I will leave to counsel. The factual question with respect to Iran's connections to al-Qaeda is very real. They have hosted al-Qaeda. They permitted al-Qaeda to transit their country. There's no doubt there is a connection between the Islamic Republic of Iran and al-Qaeda. Period, full stop.
Yeah, and I think some would argue that the Iranian government is not real happy with Sunni extremists. They have Sunni extremists in their country, but it's not sort of like they're joining forces to fight the West. They actually would just as soon eradicate Sunni extremists and have actually evicted quite a few or imprisoned quite a few. So I don't think that dog hunts very well. But I am troubled that the administration can't unequivocally say that you haven't been given power. I can tell you explicitly you have not been given power or authority by Congress to have war with Iran. And in any kind of semblance of a sane world, you would have to come back and ask us before you go into Iran. So my hope is, I'm not arguing whether the Iran's Revolutionary Guard are terrorists. My argument is that you do not have the permission of Congress to go to war in Iran. If you want a war in Iran, you have to come to us. It's the way the Constitution was written, and it needs to be very clear. And begging off and saying, well, the lawyers. No, this is our history. This is a very important question. It's a very explicit question. Only Congress can declare war. You do not have our permission to go to war in Iran, and that should be very explicit. Part of the reason we're having this debate is we've now been at war for 18 years in Afghanistan. I think even you have admitted there is no military solution to Afghanistan. It's a mess. It's nation building at its worst. The president, like myself, complains endlessly about the $50 billion we're wasting there every year. I also worry about the lives that we're wasting there. You're sending young men when there is no mission there. Can you give us any kind of summary or hope or update on the negotiations that are currently happening with the Taliban?
I can give you a brief summary. And your point about the lives, we had 3 Americans killed just this week in Afghanistan, killed by the Taliban, at least they claimed it. President Trump has made clear he wants to end what he calls this endless war. And our team is working diligently to create the conditions to do that. Ambassador Khalilzad, I think he's in Doha today or maybe in Kabul, working with the Afghan government, with other Afghans, non-Taliban, as well as with the Taliban, to create conditions so that we can deliver on what the president has said he wants done there, which is to reduce, you talked about American outlays, dollars, American taxpayer money, but also to reduce the risk for Americans. He's also told us to do that in a way that continues to reduce risk of an attack from that real estate, and we believe there's a path forward that we can achieve each of those 2 goals the president's laid out for us.
Thank you. I think we have the greatest military in the world. Nobody can measure us anywhere. We can do anything. But I'll tell you what a Navy SEAL told me. He'd been in 19 years, a couple years ago. He says, we can go anywhere. We can kill anyone. We can complete any mission you ask us. But the mistake is when you ask us to stay and plant the flag. We're not so good at nation building. Our soldiers don't want to do it. It's a huge expense of money and lives. Let's learn how to declare victory, and I commend the president for trying to declare victory, and I hope you'll support him in that.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you again, second day in a row, Secretary Pompeo. Let me just associate myself quickly with the remarks of the ranking member regarding the importance of information flows between this committee and the State Department. I understand that there's lots of classified data that we will never see. That's what the Intelligence Committee is for, but there is some that rises to such level of importance that it affects decisions that we are making on this committee and in the Senate. And I just anchor my comments in those made by the ranking member. Second, just a quick pushback on a piece of your opening statement. You did note that we are at record numbers of Foreign Service officers, and that suggests there is no hollowing out of the State Department happening. I would just remind the committee that's because we have rejected the requests from this administration to dramatically reduce the budget of the State Department. And had we enacted the requests of this administration, you would be on a glide path to record low numbers of personnel. And again, I've never been of the mind that this is the budget that you would write, Mr. Secretary, but it's just a reminder that to the extent we still are holding the line, it's because we've stayed together on this committee. Mr. Secretary, I wanted to come back to the question of Chinese technology, 5G and Huawei. I was in Dublin a couple months ago, and the embassy there noted that the Chinese embassy was exploding with personnel, and that was not coincidental to the open tender of the new high-speed network in Ireland, a country that's frankly very important to us because we have a lot of American data there and a lot of American companies there. And it struck me that we are just vastly outmanned when it comes to this contest. We have, generally in embassies, one State Department officer who's handling technology, energy, and healthcare. And then we have military attachés that, by and large are not technology experts in these places. And so you've talked in previous hearings about leveraging access to the U.S. national security apparatus. But what are the other ways in which we can get on the right side of this fight? I mean, I worry that we're losing this fight badly to the Chinese right now, in part because they just have staffed up and we haven't. I also wonder whether there's an opportunity to leverage U.S. companies, particularly in a place like Ireland, who should be sensitive to American data that they hold being, at some point, maybe way down the line, an object of national security interest from the Chinese. So what are the additional tools that we could give you to try to contest this fight over the global build-out of 5G?
So it's an important question. Let me take the second part of it first, or the second idea contained in there. We, the State Department, has to do a better job of making sure that American companies, frankly, non-Chinese companies, will always fight for ours, but that the technology systems being put in place in these countries have American values embedded within them, right? Privacy protections, concepts of property rights, all the central things that we would want from a technology system. So we have two functions. One is to make sure not only do those governments, a country like Ireland or someplace else, as well as the private entities contemplating major technology acquisition, understand the risks associated with the Chinese technology, and then we have to help our companies show up to compete. On 5G today, we're behind. It is difficult to show up with a suite, and we will always have a direct cost disadvantage there. The Chinese will subsidize in ways that we just don't. So your point about leveraging the private sector, I think, is very real. In terms of what other tools do we need, it's the case that we have just a handful of officers in most embassies around the world working on economic issues, but we have a big department, Undersecretary for Economic Affairs. I hope we'll get him confirmed before too long. So we'll do better at this. He comes out of that very space, the nominee does. I think we're close. We have to show up with our full team. When there's a competition, when there's a tender, we have to show up there and make sure that the opportunity for an alternative choice is available.
Listen, it's the fight of the next 20 to 50 years,
Yes, sir.
and we're fools if we don't staff up the State Department with a technological expertise that can win this battle. One final question. I'm looking at a Washington Post article from January of this year entitled, Can Saudi Arabia Produce Ballistic Missiles? Satellite Imagery Raises Suspicions. Notwithstanding our bipartisan concern about Iran's ballistic missile program, is it still the policy of the United States to oppose the proliferation of ballistic missile technology in the Middle East?
Yes, we're concerned about ballistic missiles in the Middle East and elsewhere, Senator.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome, Mr. Secretary. It's good to have you here.
Hello, sir.
I want you to know that I, along with many other members of this committee, would like to see the Senate confirm more of the President's nominees to the Department of State as quickly as possible. And I just want to take a moment to flag two particular nominees. They happen to be from my home state of Indiana. They're exceptional, and they need to move forward very quickly. Stephen Ackard is the nominee to be the Director of the Office of Foreign Missions. It's been more than 12 months ago since the President first nominated Stephen Ackard. That needs to move forward. Many people don't fully understand the position he was nominated to serve in, but effectively he's the top human resources officer for the Foreign Service. So this is a critical member of your team, and I commend you for being able to operate short-staffed. The second nominee I wanted to mention is Kip Tom. I've known Kip for a number of years, highly qualified. He knows more about agriculture than I'll ever aspire to know. But look, he's been nominated to serve as ambassador and U.S. representative to the UN agencies for food and agriculture. It's been over 8 months. And for farmers in Indiana and other states, I know it's critically important to have a voice at the United Nations speaking on behalf of our farmers and ranchers. So the good news is that both of these nominees were reported favorably from this committee to the full Senate last week, but both of these nominees remain among more than 60 outstanding nominations referred to this committee that are pending in the Senate. I just urge my colleagues and Senate leadership to confirm both of these highly qualified nominees as soon as possible. I'd like to pivot to Venezuela, Mr. Secretary, and just begin by indicating I know this crisis is deeply complex and you're following it incredibly closely. It's growing more challenging by the day, it seems. I described the situation from my perspective in a letter that I sent to you and the President and the Vice President last week, but I wanted to bring it up to you directly. There are Americans who we know are suffering at the hands of the Maduro regime today. Todd Leininger from Indiana has been in prison since April of 2014 when he was convicted by a Venezuelan court in the midst of anti-government protests. Now, many questions remain over the due process that was afforded to Todd, but my concern now is that in November of 2018, a San Cristobal court ordered Todd's release, yet the Venezuelan authorities continue to detain Todd without explanation. I'm in regular contact with Todd's mother. She has concerns for Todd's not just welfare, but his very life. There's drinking water shortages, severe unsanitary conditions, and other medical concerns that I probably shouldn't air publicly, but let's just say we're concerned about Todd's welfare. So, Mr. Secretary, while the diplomatic process I know is being worked on, I want to know what specifically you're doing to bring Americans like Todd home. And then secondarily, I want to see what members of this committee can do to assist you and Special Envoy Abrams moving forward so that we can help Todd and others be brought home safely and as quickly as possible.
Thanks for the question. Look, folks on this committee, we spend a lot of time working to get Americans that are wrongfully detained all around the world home. It's a focus. I had a big group of them come visit, would have been a week ago today. It was really remarkable to have these families, to hear from them. Some of them still have folks detained. Some have lost their loved ones. It re-impressed, I think, upon me and my whole team how central this is to what we're doing. To the extent you all talk about this issue, raise this issue, voice the concerns, people around the world hear that. So I think that is important in its own right. And as we think about our policies with respect to, in this case, Venezuela, we should keep in mind that there are many concerns, one of which is the fact they're wrongfully detaining U.S. persons. Second, with respect to particular cases, it is more difficult today. We have now withdrawn our diplomatic staff from Caracas. So our ability to engage in consular activities of all kinds is absolutely increased. I regret that we had to make that decision. I think it was the right one. But know that we are still having conversations with a broad range of Venezuelans, working diligently to try and make the case to get every American returned home.
Mr. Secretary, lastly, do you feel like you have sufficient resources to deal with the crisis in Venezuela? I know the administration has requested $500 million to assist with the democratic transition. Would that also deal with the situation that I just spoke to, Todd's situation and other American detainees? And if not, tell us what else you need, please.
Senator, I think we have the resources we need. I don't think we're lacking for either people or resources to execute that mission.
Thank you.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Mr. Secretary, North Korea remains a significant threat.
Yes, sir.
And we know that after the two summits, there still has been no tangible progress towards denuclearization. We know that Kim Jong-un is expanding his nuclear weapons program and that he continues to exploit overseas slave labor. He is conducting cyber heists to enrich himself. And we simply can't get results from Kim Jong-un by relieving pressure upon him and his regime. You recently said that the Trump administration put more sanctions in place against North Korea than at any time in world's history. However, the UN panel on experts warned on March 5th of this year that there are severe deficiencies in the global pressure campaign. It states that there have been, quote, a massive increase in illegal ship-to-ship transfers of petroleum products and coal, and that, quote, they render the latest United Nations sanctions ineffective. So the experts are saying that the gaps are growing, yet the Trump administration has added only 34 names to our sanctions list, down from 207 the year before. That's an 83% drop, Mr. Secretary, and we know that UN sanctions resolutions are only as strong as member state enforcement, and the world follows America's lead. When President Trump, after the Treasury Department sanctioned 2 China-based companies, asked on Twitter for those listings to be undone, we confused the very allies and partners we need to help solve this problem peacefully, Mr. Secretary. So from my perspective, Kim merrily rolls along with his development of his nuclear weapons program. Our sanctions regime is being criticized by the panel of experts, and ultimately, from my perspective, I see Kim Jong-un just trying to play out the string to the end of your administration with absolutely no results that can be pointed to in reducing the nuclear threat from that country. Please respond.
Yeah, so I agree with some of what you said, but not much. You described an 83% decrease in our increase in sanctions. And you may think the enforcement regime is ineffective, but you should move to the outskirts of Pyongyang, because those folks think it's very effective. I concede there's more that can be done. I will concede that China has imperfectly enforced those sanctions. Concede that there are still ship-to-ship transfers taking place. That is absolutely true. You should know that in every one of those dimensions, the things that are happening inside the country.
Do you agree that there's been a massive increase in ship-to-ship illegal oil transfers?
I don't know about massive, but let me assure you there's less coal, less fuel, less resource there today than there was when President Obama was in office.
Well, it's not effective if the programs are actually expanding, that the ship-to-ship oil transfers are actually increasing. It's not effective.
Senator, there is an enormous undertaking, not just the United States undertaking, to take down these ship-to-ship transfers. You should know that rogue regimes are difficult. They'll move, they'll go red. It's a big ocean out there. But you should know that your United States government is working diligently to enforce those sanctions and working to get our partners in the region, South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, the Vietnamese, the Chinese, if I didn't mention that already, to help us to enforce those sanctions. I concede we need to continue to keep the pressure on, Senator.
Well, when the expert panel says that it's ineffective and the president undermines the very effort that we're trying to put in place to say to the Chinese, say to the Russians, you got to get tough, we're going to hold you accountable, and then the president is tweeting out that we're not going to have those additional sanctions put in place, it just sends the wrong signal to North Korea, but to China, and to Russia, and to anyone else that we're trying to get to cooperate in a regime to tighten the pressure on Kim Jong-un. So I just have a big problem with understanding what the strategy is, ultimately, to get Kim to make the concessions on his nuclear weapons program, if in fact the sanctions regime is being ultimately relaxed. It's ineffective, and the signal is being sent to the Chinese, we will not sanction you if you violate those sanctions. How can that be effective, Mr. Secretary?
Senator, the North Korean economy will shrink this year.
Well, Will it result in actual concessions that are made?
This is a long process. We took over in a place where there were very limited sanctions, no effort to enforce, no diplomatic engagement to create a global coalition. We were
that's 2.5 years ago.
Senator, we weren't even leading from behind. We refused to engage against this threat. And we've taken this seriously. We're going to continue to take it seriously. We've got them to stop missile testing. We have them to stop nuclear testing. We're going to keep at it.
Right. Well, look at the economy may be going down in North Korea. It's just not going down enough. The sanctions aren't tough enough. We're not pressuring them enough. We're not sending the right signals to China and to Russia to cut it off even further. So yeah, it might be going down, but it's not going down on a level that's affecting Kim in terms of making concessions to us or the president at the summit that reflects that we, in fact, have been successful. So the only answer to me is that we have to make it stronger. We just have to be realistic about this, or else in another year and a half, the Trump administration will have been completed, and there will have been no reduction in the nuclear program of North Korea. So that's just my bottom line. Looking at it, Mr. Secretary, make them tougher. The sanctions have to be toughened. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you. Senator Portman.
Thank you. First of all, Secretary Pompeo, thank you for your service, being our diplomat around the world. You mentioned the returning Americans home efforts that you have made in meeting with families last week, and one of those families was the parents of Otto Warmbier. And I thank you for staying in touch with them. They appreciated it. I'll be in Korea next week talking, among others, to our ambassador, Admiral Harris, and South Korean officials about what's going on in North Korea and continuing to hold up their human rights abuses and expose for everyone what happened to Otto and what's happening to others, including North Koreans. So thank you for staying on top of that issue. And of course, tighter sanctions is something we should all want as we begin to see some progress as a result of the sanctions we have put in place. I want to talk about the Global Engagement Center quickly and about Ukraine. On the Global Engagement Center, you recall Senator Murphy and I a few years ago started working on encouraging state to not just establish the center, but to properly fund it. I want to thank you because this year you have made a request in your budget of $76.5 million, which is a 38% increase from last year's request. I know you've got a tight budget, and I know you're being asked to find cuts elsewhere. And this is encouraging to me because I think it's undeniable that the propaganda and disinformation that's going on around the world, including from state actors, and we're going to learn a lot more, I think, about Russia even the next few weeks here in terms of what they're doing. In this session, we can't talk about some of the details, but the reality is it's such a huge threat, and I think your former role at the Central Intelligence Agency probably informs you better than other secretaries of state. So I assume that having recognized that, this budget increase is reflecting your concern. Having said that, one thing we haven't gotten done yet is this DOD transfer. We've authorized a $60 million transfer from DOD for this fiscal year 2019. It's authorized by law. Can you confirm that you all have requested that full $60 million from DOD?
Senator, we have requested that.
Thank you. Do you see this process going a little more smoothly this year? Last fiscal year, recall, we got it at the 11th hour, maybe the 11th and a half hour, if that's possible. Any sense of where we are this year?
Senator, we're working on it. It did take us a long time last year. I hope that it goes more quickly this year. We've now done it once, so I think there's a mechanism in place. I'm hopeful it'll move along more quickly.
Interagency cooperation is one reason we put this in place, where you've got to go to the State Department or the Defense Department. They've got to work with you. Do you feel as though the interagency process is working well? We want DOD's help in this effort.
You mean with respect to the GEC?
With respect to GEC.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we've made strides. Look, it took us a little while. We didn't have someone there that we'd chosen to lead that organization. We now have that person in place, and I think it's improved dramatically, really, over what's now the last 2 months.
With regard to Ukraine, quickly, and thank you for the GEC help, we have finally, as you know, provided help to the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves. And that was a change in this administration. We appreciate that. Lethal and non-lethal security assistance so they can defend their own sovereign territory. In the National Defense Authorization Bill 2 years ago, we authorized naval assistance for the first time. And particularly what's gone on since then on the Kerch Strait means that we need to do all we can to help deal with the naval side of this. that the Russians are being increasingly aggressive. Do you know what the status is of transferring these 2 excess island-class cutters to the Ukrainian Navy, and are you encouraging of that?
I am encouraging it. I do not know the status, Senator.
Okay. I appreciate you guys getting back to me on that. It seems to me that that's one of our pressing capability gaps we have. Can you speak to other concerns you might have about what's going on in Ukraine, particularly vis-a-vis Russia?
So we are now years into this, and it is frozen at best. Still challenges, still fighting along the line of control nearly every day. You know, I think everyone's staring at the Ukrainian election now, a handful more days before the Ukrainians will select their next leader. And we will engage closely with whoever that leader is to ensure that we continue to provide support for Ukrainian democracy.
Well, I appreciate that. I do think we're at a critical time right now. We'll see what happens in the election. I plan to go over after the election, meet with the new government, but it is a frozen conflict. I've been on the contact line. On the other hand, I think we have begun to change the dynamic by the support you provided. We've got to continue to do it. I have one other question. Maybe you can send something in response as a written response, but it has to do with the sanctions regime. I'm hearing from some folks that state that they're having a tough time sanctioning certain Russian individuals because the Treasury Department indicates that our legislation here is too restrictive. In other words, that legislation as it relates to specific things like Ukraine and what happened in Crimea might not relate exactly to a particular individual who is otherwise involved in malign efforts that affect the national security interests of the United States. Would it be helpful for you to have a broader sanctions regime that this body could send you in order to ensure that the individuals that you would like to sanction are able to be sanctioned?
I think it's definitely worth taking a look at. Some of this is on the Treasury side, so the relief would need to be for the broader scope would need to be for Treasury sanctions. But I'd love to see that, and we should evaluate and make sure we do it in a thoughtful way so that we actually pick up what we're looking for.
Okay, if you could provide us some further information on that, that'd
Happy
be
to
helpful
do that,
as
yes,
what
sir.
you're looking for. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I've talked to Senator Portman, just for your information. I've talked with Senator Crapo about this exact issue on the sanctions. He raises some important points. I think we need to get together to talk about that with the Banking Committee. So it's a joint effort. Senator Udall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you,
Yes, sir.
Secretary Pompeo, for being here, and thank you for your service. You mentioned in terms of other questions that it was still the policy of the United States to prevent missile proliferation in the Middle East. And I wanted to ask, based on what was said earlier in articles that have been put in the record about the Chinese selling missiles to Saudi Arabia, have you spoken up and told Saudi Arabia we don't appreciate their aggressive acquisition of Chinese missiles?
There are, I shouldn't say every, there are very few conversations that I have with the leadership in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that I don't make clear that we prefer they purchase American systems, and not Chinese systems across a broader way, whether it's telecommunications or otherwise.
Yeah, and are we seeing what many of our foreign policy folks that have been in the region a long time very worried about an arms race? Is this indication of the Chinese penetration into Saudi Arabia and missile sales? Is this an indication we're headed down the road to an arms race? And what are we doing about it if it's our policy to prevent this kind of thing?
So, Senator, it's a good question. I think it's a little more complicated than that. Look, the Middle East has had arms and arms issues for an awfully long time. This particular set of issues surrounding missiles, you see issues in the region with, we haven't talked about Turkey and their S-400 purchase. So missile defense, anti-aircraft systems. This is certainly something that we all need to keep an eye on. I will tell you that most of the folks who are working to build out missile systems are doing so directly because the Islamic Republic of Iran was permitted to continue its missile program under the JCPOA. It didn't slow them down. And so others are doing what they need to do to create a deterrence tool for themselves. It's just a fact.
Yeah, well, I very much hope that the administration will push back in terms of what's happening in missiles across the Middle East. Secretary Pompeo, our southern border increasingly looks like a war zone, like Germany with the Berlin Wall or the DMZ on the Korean Peninsula. We have Border Patrol agents harassing and separating families and caging children, members of the military supporting a made-up emergency, when the reality is that the U.S. border communities are just as safe and often safer than anywhere else in the United States. This is reminiscent of how we enemies treat one another. Is Mexico the enemy of the United States?
There were 20,000 apprehensions last week of illegal entrants into our country. This is a real crisis. These are numbers that I think when we took office, the numbers were, I'll have the numbers wrong, but 20,000 last week. We're working closely with the Mexican government to create the conditions there which will stop this. I work very closely with Foreign Minister Ebrard. He's been a great partner, but they have not yet effectively been able to stop what is mostly transit through their country from these folks coming into our country, and President Trump's determined to create sovereignty and protect our border.
Do you believe that the U.S. should close the southern border in response to the asylum seekers you just spoke about?
You know, with the laws as we have them today, I worked on an agreement where we would allow those with proper asylum claims to wait for their asylum hearing. The numbers are overwhelming to wait in Mexico. We had a court fundamentally misread the law and deny us the ability to do that. We need your help. We need Congress to change these rules. We know that some of the folks who come across have legitimate asylum claims, but the system is broken, and we need Congress to change the laws so that we can protect our southern borders. It's not just people who are coming there. It's drugs, it's weapons. The stories, you know them, about human trafficking that's taking place, or what's happening to women as they move across Mexico is truly tragic. If we can secure our southern border, we will improve the lives of those people. I'm convinced of it.
Do you believe our country is, quote, full, as the president has said, and that we should not accept any more asylum seekers or immigrants to the United States?
This is the most generous nation in the history of civilization. just the case. As the president has said, repeatedly, the president has said repeatedly, he's talked about lawful immigration. The work that we're doing is along our southern border to prevent people from coming in here unlawfully, illegally. That's the mission set that he's set out. It's what I'm working with the Northern Triangle countries and Mexico as a foreign policy matter to take care of.
Well, the reality is, and I think a lot of policy experts on the Northern Triangle are saying it's a very bad policy to cut off foreign aid to the three countries down there where these folks are originating from, and that's one of our levers to keep them there and to keep the countries more stable. But I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
You are.
Let me apologize and thank you for the courtesies, and I will yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your service to our country and your leadership. A couple of questions for you, and I'll try to do this quickly. In your testimony, you stated the United States' future security, prosperity, and leadership depends on maintaining a free, open, and secure Indo-Pacific. To advance the Indo-Pacific strategy, the budget request nearly doubles U.S. foreign assistance resources targeting this crucial area compared to the FY 2019 request. Do you commit to fully implement the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, or ARIA, that we have discussed many times?
We think ARIA makes great sense, and we will do our level best to fully comply.
Including
getting your reports that are late.
Thank you. And I was going to talk about the two reports. We have the report on Association of Southeast Asian Nations Human Rights Strategy and the report on approach and strategies as it relates to denuclearization of the North Korean government.
We're close, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for that. And could you quickly identify a few new programs you'll build out to prioritize under ARIA? Build out or prioritize under ARIA?
Oh, goodness. May I let our team come brief?
Yes,
we have racked and stacked how we think about this. I'd love to have the team get your feedback as well on the way to, if we've got the right metrics for our prioritization.
You bet. Thanks, Mr. Secretary. And today, April 10th, marks the 40th anniversary of the enactment of the Taiwan Relations Act. 40 years ago, April 10th, the Taiwan Relations Act was signed into law, which together with President Reagan's 1982 Six Assurances, the Taiwan Travel Act, and ARIA have become the cornerstones of our relationship with Taiwan. A little over a week ago, for the first time in 20 years, there appears to have been an intentional crossing of the median line of the Taiwan Straits by Chinese jets. Do you plan to fully implement the TRA, the Taiwan Travel Act, and the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act to further strengthen our partnership with Taiwan?
Yes.
Will you commit to send high-level delegations to Taiwan in the near future to demonstrate U.S. commitment to Taiwan and the Taiwanese people?
You know, we've a lot of work going on at the AIT at the our center there. Yeah, we're going to keep at it. We see the increase in China's activity, both political, information warfare, and then, as you described, actually on the real estate. We see how China's continued to be more aggressive with Taiwan. We talk with the Chinese. Every conversation I have with the Chinese begins with this discussion. I think they understand America's policy is constant and enduring.
And I believe both Japan and Taiwan scrambled jets to push back the Chinese incursion.
I believe that's correct as well.
On China, quick aside, there's a new extradition agreement that Hong Kong has agreed to with China or is in discussions with. On China, the European Union today has warned journalists of this new extradition that they could face extradition to China and perhaps face jail time in China over this new extradition law. Has the State Department made any decisions or discussions relating to Hong Kong's new extradition discussions with China?
I'm aware of this. We are reviewing it. I don't believe we've made any decisions yet.
Would a possible warning to U.S. journalists or civil society activists, would that a possible warning come from the State Department as a result of that extradition law?
I need to look at it. I know the team's reviewing what took place there, and I need to see what impact it has on American citizens traveling in the region, including the occupations you just described.
Thank you. Your testimony, you stated that our diplomatic efforts toward the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea are the most successful that have ever been undertaken. We remain committed to that goal. This budget provides for our diplomatic outreach to continue implementation and enforcement of sanctions until we achieve our objective. Do you commit to the full enforcement of existing sanctions against the North Korean regime under U.S. law, including all of those mandated by the North Korea Sanctions Policy Enhancement Act and ARIA?
Yes, Senator.
Do you agree that no sanctions against North Korea should be lifted until North Korea demonstrates a commitment to complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization?
I want to leave a little space there. From time to time, there are particular provisions that if we were making substantial progress, that one might think, that was the right thing to do to achieve. Sometimes it's visas. So I want to leave a little room. But yes, your point is well taken. The enforcement regime, the core UN Security Council resolutions need to remain in place until the verification of denuclearization has been completed.
And would you support further sanctions legislation by this Congress, the lead act that Senator Markey and I have introduced, or others?
Conceptually, yes. I'm not familiar with that legislation.
When it comes to China, yesterday we had a hearing, the Subcommittee of East Asia, where we heard from witnesses who were discussing the situation that Uyghurs face in Xinjiang in China, also discussed China's approach to Tibet, as well as hearing from a witness testifying about the genocide in Burma. Could you talk a little bit about how we are approaching these human rights violations and what we will do specifically to address the Uyghur situation and what we are further doing in Burma?
So I don't want to get out in front of decisions we're working on with respect to other policies we may take, but we have been incredibly candid about what's taking place inside of China, and not only to the Uyghurs but to the Kazakhs and Christians. This is historic. The numbers are staggering. It's certainly into the hundreds of thousands of people. It began, this information management, this Orwellian state began in Tibet. It's now been expanded. The same gentleman who ran the program previously now is running this program in Xinjiang. This is a very serious matter, very serious human rights violation. State Department and, frankly, other elements of the United States government are working diligently to make clear that this is not acceptable behavior.
Yesterday, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was taken to a hospital for a health concern. I think everything is all right. Would the United States ever consider legitimizing a secession, a leader following the Dalai Lama that was anointed by China?
Senator, it doesn't seem likely, right?
I hope the answer is no.
Yeah, I want to. That's a complicated question. I'm happy to talk to you about it. No, we understand national boundaries. We understand the history. We understand what China is trying to do. And you should know there hasn't been an administration that has taken on China in a way that this one has determined to take on every dimension: military, diplomatic, the trade agreement, the economics, the intellectual property theft. It is robust, human rights included.
Thanks, Mr.
We're serious about this, making sure that China behaves in a way that reflects American value set.
Thank you.
Senator Rubio. No, they're done. You're up.
Everybody went over there?
Yep.
Thank you for being here. On the president recently expressed dissatisfaction with the amount of cocaine that's being produced in Colombia, and I thought it was important to point, I know he's aware of this, that the migratory situation coming from Venezuela into Colombia is an extraordinary drain on that nation's resources. We have ELN and other drug groups operating openly and with impunity on the Venezuelan side of the border with the support of all of the Venezuelan government officials. The migrants, by the way, are very vulnerable people, some of whom are now being actively recruited in efforts to get them to join some of these gangs on the border. The drug flights that come out of Venezuela carrying the cocaine headed north, by the way, many of those planes land right in the Northern Triangle countries where they're passed on to drug trafficking organizations that are fueled by the drug proceeds and, of course, are a key part of destabilizing Central America, leading to our migratory crisis. On top of that, in Venezuela, you have an active and growing Russian military presence, as we've seen in open source reporting. Yesterday, open source reports about the resumption of direct flights from Iran by the airline that our nation has sanctioned for support to the IRGC. And adding to all of this fun and games is the fact that we know that they have purchased a series of man-pads, Russian-made systems, which in a place where you've got gangs acting with impunity in the street, links to drug trafficking organizations, linked to guerrilla groups on the border, there is always the concern that these man-pads could be stolen or transferred for profit. They're involved in every sort of illegal traffic imaginable. So I guess it leads to the question, could not the argument be made, or is it our position, that the Maduro regime, based on all of this that I've just outlined, represents a direct threat to the national interest and the national security of the United States?
Senator, I don't think there's any doubt that that's the case, that the Maduro regime presents a threat to the United States of America. You mentioned Iran. The Hezbollah has been in South America. This risk is very real. The drugs, something that's been around for a long time, that is not a new problem. And now the Russian footprint. Couple that with their connection to the Cubans and their the Cuban inner circle that is around Maduro, and it is clearly the case that the former leadership of Venezuela, the Maduro regime, is a true threat to the United States of America.
And I guess the broader point is that of course we care about human rights and democracy in our region, especially in our hemisphere, and we're going to be supportive of it. But beyond that, there is a national security interest for the United States and what's happening there.
Senator, that we agree.
And one more point on these gangs. They call them the colectivos. You're aware of them, as we've seen. The normal argument here out there is the military is sticking with Maduro, and there's truth to that. But really what he's using now to control the country and repress are 50,000 members of over 500 gangs, literally street gangs, that he's armed and actually openly calls upon to take to the streets and repress people. It would be my view, and I think the White House would and the State Department would share it, that these military officials, high-ranking military officials, who in the past in Venezuela have openly discussed how these groups are unconstitutional and operating outside the law, it would be incumbent upon them to step forward and confront these groups at a minimum. They may not do a coup d'etat, they may not take out Maduro, but they must confront these armed groups in Venezuela who are basically running the streets.
Senator, we agree, and we have, to the extent we've had the capacity to talk to them directly, we have shared that they need to do that. It's a bit embarrassing to be a Venezuelan senior leader. You've got the Cubans protecting Maduro, and you've got the colectivos keeping down people inside of the country. We hope they will. We hope they'll make decisions that are very, very different from that. We've also spoken about this publicly. It's a real threat. These little roving gangs are doing enormous harm inside of the country. There's not only there water shortages and food shortages, but they're now Venezuelan people are being observed by these collectivos, and their behavior isn't consistent with what Maduro would wish. They're under the thumb of these roving gangs.
Yeah, just one side note on that. These gangs, they'll be repressing people on the street and attacking them, and spot somebody walking down the street and snatch a purse and then go back to repressing. They're criminals. One last question. I support the designation of the IRGC. I think that was the right decision. Has the administration made clear through every channel that if, in fact, now, as a result of this, U.S. troops in Iraq are targeted, not just designated terrorist groups, but targeted, whether it's by Shia militias, the IRGC, or a combination thereof, no matter who targets us in Iraq from that Shia militias or the Iranians, that we will hold Iran directly responsible for any harm that comes to our personnel in the region, even if they do it through a third-party surrogate.
Senator, we have made clear that Iran cannot escape responsibility for any harm that comes to United States interest anywhere in the world by doing it through a proxy force. They understand President Trump's policy.
Thank you.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome. Thank you for your service. I want to talk a little bit about Iran. And,
Yes, sir.
And let me start out by thanking you and the administration for designating Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization. As you know, that's a step I've long advocated, have introduced legislation to move it forward. And I wanted to ask you to explain to this committee and the American people why designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization is, number one, justified on the merits, and number two, what the consequences of that designation are, specifically for financial institutions or corporations doing business with IRGC-affiliated entities.
Senator, right, by its very name, people say the IRGC, and sometimes they get the I and the R wrong. This is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I think that's important. They named themselves appropriately. It's a terrorist organization. It's killed over 600 Americans. The number's probably far higher than that. They continue to engage in terror around the world, including assassinations campaigns in Europe and the West. This was a kind of easy decision, reflecting reality, and so I'm happy that we were able to announce that decision yesterday. Second, with respect to its impact, the IRGC has another component, which is what I'll call the kleptocracy component. It runs a significant piece of the Iranian economy. The numbers vary, but I've seen numbers as high as 20 or 25% of the Iranian economy has resources and wealth that transfer to the IRGC itself. If you're the general counsel of an Asian bank or a European bank, your world changed when that designation came out yesterday. If you're thinking about doing business or providing material support in any way to any company that might be connected to the IRGC, this sanction will cause you not to do that. From our goal, what that will do is it will deny them the resources to continue their terror campaign around the world.
Thank you for that answer. You and I worked together as there was an interagency debate within the administration about whether the president should pull out of the Iranian nuclear deal. I think the president made unquestionably the right decision. As you know, there were significant voices within the State Department that resisted that step, and that I believe continue to resist that step. And I want to talk to you about two different aspects of implementing that decision to pull out of the Iran deal, namely the nuclear waivers and the oil waivers. On the nuclear waivers, as you know, we have waivers that allow Iran to continue with supposedly non-military nuclear research. If you look to the extraordinary results that the Israeli raid seized from Iran, that debunked what we were told by the Obama administration and the International Atomic Energy Agency, and made clear that there were entire parts of Iran's civilian nuclear program that were built in order to create nuclear weapons, and that it was little more than a sham. I want to ask your view on should we continue to grant nuclear waivers. As I understand, they're up for renewal next month. Should we continue to grant nuclear waivers given the rather significant evidence that doing so could further Iran acquiring nuclear weapons?
Senator, I think this administration I think it's hard to challenge the fact that we have been tough with respect to sanctions on Iran. With respect to particular waiver decisions, both these and the crude oil ones, I don't have any announcements to make today. We need to make sure that they wind through the process appropriately. Your point about different opinions inside the State Department, we got 90,000 employees. We probably have that many opinions. Make no mistake about it. We will stare closely at this on the non-proliferation waivers. I'd love to talk to you in a classified setting about it. It's complicated. But suffice it to say, President Trump, I can assure the American people, I can assure the world, President Trump will continue to ratchet up the pressure on the Islamic Republic of Iran such that their behavior will change.
Well, there will be a critical decision point next month also concerning the oil waivers, and it's been publicly reported that there is currently an interagency dispute between the State Department and the Energy Department about whether to grant those waivers again. Right now, Iran is producing roughly 1.2 million barrels of oil a day. That's generating billions of dollars. That is funding the Ayatollah, and I believe endangering our security. What are your views on whether allowing Iran to continue to produce 1.2 million barrels of oil a day and sell it on the world market, is that in our national interest?
I think the State Department, I think we've been clear about our objective of getting Iran to zero just as quickly as we possibly can, and we will continue to do that.
Well, let me urge you and urge the Department unequivocally not to grant the nuclear waivers and not to grant the oil waivers. I think maximum pressure should mean maximum pressure. You have been a strong voice for that, and let me encourage you to continue that strong position defending our national security.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Barrasso.
Thank you very much, and I just wanted to add, thank you very much for being here, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir.
I just want to add my voice to that of Senator Cruz's. 21 of us sent a letter to President Trump last month on Iran oil sanctions. It's, as you were just saying, 80% of Iran's revenues come from oil exports. I think the more we can do to shut that down as quickly as possible, I think the more important it is, especially with the new waivers perhaps happening as early as next month. So thank you for that attention to that issue. I wanted to switch to Turkey and the S-400 and the issues that are going on there. Now, you and I had a chance to talk about this a couple of weeks ago. I'm very concerned about Turkey's plan to obtain the S-400, the surface-to-air missile defense systems from Russia. They want to do that in July. I would recommend to you an editorial in the New York Times today, a U.S. fighter jet or a Russian missile system, not both, by Senator Risch, Senator Menendez, the ranking members of this committee, as well as by Senators Inhofe and Reid, who are the ranking member and chair of the Armed Services Committee. I think Turkey's purchase of the S-400, it reduces the interoperability of that system with our allies. It poses a serious threat to the security of our F-35 fighter jets and the entire NATO system. A number of us were visiting with a number of NATO countries over the last couple of weeks. Great concern over that. I know the Secretary General, who celebrated the 70th anniversary of NATO with us in the joint session of Congress, has similar concerns. On April 2nd of this year, the Department of Defense announced it would halt all F-35 equipment transfers to Turkey unless it abandons plans to acquire the S-400. So I'd just like for you to give us an overview of the risks to the U.S. and NATO security as a result of Turkey trying to integrate the S-400 system and our F-35 fighters in the air defense.
So I'll leave the details to the experts, but as I have been briefed by the Department of Defense team, it is not possible to both fly the F-35 in space where the S-400 is significantly operable. That's not a very technical description, but the two cannot coexist. We've made that clear through the foreign ministry channels. We made it clear to General Carr through the Department of Defense channels. This very challenge, this technical challenge it presents. We now have provided an opportunity for the Turks to buy American system that will provide them with the air defense capability that they want for their country. That offer is on the table. The details are being worked through, and we've made clear to the Turks as plainly as we can. They build a significant component of the F-35 as well. Not only are they purchasers and customers, but they are producers, a part of the supply chain for the F-35. We've made clear that none of that can exist if the S-400 is purchased by them.
Are there consequences that you have in mind that Turkey should face if they do go ahead with that purchase?
Well, I think as a statutory matter, well, the lawyers will have to sort through the details, but The S-400 is a significant weapon system, and we've shared with them. We've asked them to go take a look at CATSA, what that might well mean for them. It's just, I think Acting Secretary Shanahan said it best yesterday. Says that we can't continue to have the F-35 operable in space where the S-400 is also sitting.
And I think one of the other topics you and I had a chance to discuss was Nord Stream 2. I mean, it came up when we were at the Munich Defense Conference. It continues to come up for discussion. To me, it's Putin's pipeline. It's a trap, a Russian trap the Germans are seeming willing to enter into. And your thoughts on, are there things that Germany has done over the last year to ensure that Nord Stream 2 would either not proceed without guarantees that Russian oil will be able to continue to be exported through Ukraine, because the questions were raised earlier about Ukraine and the stability of that country, and I think Senator Portman is heading there right after the election. Some of us were there right before the first round of the elections.
So we're working. So President Trump's made clear Nord Stream 2 underwrites the Russians. When we were with the NATO group, most of the countries of NATO see that same risk and so share America's concern there. The Germans appear intent on continuing to build that pipeline, and we are working with them to see if there is a path forward that we can, at the very least, ensure that there's energy that transits through Ukraine. There may be an outcome there. We've done just about all we can to discourage the Europeans, primarily the Germans, from building Nord Stream 2, and we've done that without success to date.
And final question in terms of incredible U.S. military success against ISIS. Are there things that you can share with us now that the caliphate has been defeated, that the administration is shifting in terms of its strategy to deal with insurgents and to rid the region of any kind of additional violent extremism that could do damage, with the intention of doing damage to the United States?
So both in Syria and Iraq, we have State Department, often with military teams on the ground, working to see if there are ways that we can get the global community to underwrite stabilization and reconstruction efforts in Iraq, so that there's a less likelihood that we'll get the next variant of Sunni terror in Anbar and in the west of Iraq. The Iraqi government's in full support of this. The Iraqi security forces, our military works closely with to build out security institutions so that the risk that the next variant of Sunni extremism, Sunni terrorism in the region doesn't march on Baghdad and Erbil again.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Menendez.
Mr. Secretary, this administration has still failed to provide the legally required determination on the role of the Crown Prince in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and despite superfluous briefings and additional determinations from the Treasury Department this week, you're still not in compliance with the law, nor has the administration provided a justification for its lack of respect for the law. So my question is, have you discussed with the President of the White House whether to make a determination about the Crown Prince's responsibility for Mr. Khashoggi's death?
Senator, I'm not going to talk about conversations I had with the President. I'm confident that we're in compliance with the law. We simply disagree.
Let me read the law to you. Let me read the law to you, and the author is sitting next to me. Not later than 120 days after receiving a request that meets the requirements of paragraph 2, which is when the chair and the ranking member of the relevant committee, this committee, previous chairman and I, made such a request, the President shall, not may, not could, he shall determine if that person has engaged in such an activity, and which is an activity in violation of the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Act, and submit a classified or unclassified report to the chairperson and ranking member of the committee that submitted the request with respect to that determination, and includes a statement of whether or not the President intends to impose sanctions with respect to the person. Shall. I mean, I know you graduated from a great law school. Shall is shall. I didn't graduate from Harvard, but I graduated from Rutgers Law School. Shall is shall. It means you must. And yet, you refuse to get, even if your determination is that he hasn't, but you refuse to give us a determination. And the message that that sends globally, for example, we have President el-Sisi here. If he believes that you can do anything with impunity just because you have some strategic interest with the United States or any other actor in the world, then you have a dangerous precedent. How is it that the CIA, according to public records, can conclude that the Saudi Crown Prince ordered the killing of Mr. Khashoggi, and yet the administration has taken no action regarding a Magnitsky determination, not sanctions on other people, a Magnitsky determination as required by the law and requested by the chairman and the ranking member of this committee?
Senator, I would never refer to even a public report of something that the CIA had determined. I just wouldn't do it. I don't think it's in America's best interest for elected officials to be seconding what some reporter thinks they've gotten from classified information. Second, with respect to the Global Magnitsky
Well, I think you should
Act,
tell Senator Graham that too.
yeah, I would tell anyone, Senator.
Bottom line is there are public
I would
reports
tell
that
anyone
speak
that.
to this, and there's a whole host of public reports that speak to things that unfortunately the government doesn't tell us, even as members of the Senate, as we found out yesterday.
Senator, you know I don't want to get debate. There are jurisdictional issues between the Intelligence Committee and this committee that you're deeply aware of.
Can you give me the legal justification? Has the Office of the Legal Counsel, legal advisor, provided you with an opinion that says you don't have to do this?
I'm confident that we are doing everything that we're required to do.
That's not what I asked you.
Yeah,
Did the Office of the Legal Advisor provide you an opinion that says you don't have to do this?
Senator, we are in compliance with the law.
You did not answer my question.
Yeah, I've given you the answer I'm prepared to provide this morning.
Well, let me give you an answer to something else that since my colleague, Senator Johnson, invoked my name in disdain, I wasn't going to talk about this, but since he opened the door, let me speak to it. Mr. Bullatow and other nominees. I hope that Senator Johnson is concerned about political firings and retribution at the State Department, as he is about some of these nominees. After removing the prior Undersecretary for Management, Pat Kennedy, a career Foreign Service officer who knew the department well, the Trump administration failed to nominate a replacement for 142 days. Then the president nominated a candidate with zero experience managing a large organization whose nomination languished for a year because Republicans and Democrats in Congress did not believe he was fit to move forward through the process before the administration acknowledged that and then took him out of the job nomination. 509 days after Pat Kennedy was fired, the White House finally submitted a second nominee to the committee. Now, this nominee is ready to go forward if the department gives us the critical information that we have been asking that has already been provided to an inspector general and a special counsel on information that is critical for this committee's oversight of the department. But it's failed to do so a year later. Now, I know many of my colleagues, including you, Mr. Secretary, when you were a House member, I could read you the quotes, spoke elegantly of the responsibility of oversight. Yet you deny, you're stonewalling this committee from getting that information. And finally, talk about characterizing nominees as excellent or outstanding candidates. We have nominees with temporary restraining orders who failed to disclose lawsuits to this committee, who have Me Too issues, who even lack some basic knowledge about their postings. Amazingly enough, we have some nominees who have either written or retweeted vile things about current and former senators on this committee and their families, which speaks to their judgment as someone who's going to represent the United States in the world. Do you think it's appropriate for our nominee to retweet a post stating George Soros, the leader of their movement, worked for Hitler, helping kill his own people, the Jews? Or do you think it's appropriate for that same nominee to retweet a post alleging that Heidi Cruz, the wife of Senator Cruz, is an architect of the North American Union whose goal is to destroy the sovereignty of the United States, and to retweet personal attacks accusing Senator Cruz of being a whole host of other things I won't get into? Or do you think it's appropriate for that same nominee to retweet a picture of Senator Romney with the words dumbass on it, which goes on to say that Senator Romney, Satan has a hold on you, surely you'll go to hell? Is this the type of nominee? And I could go through a whole host of others. So we're going to start talking about nominees. We're working very hard to try to move forward. I left to speak about General Abizaid on the floor, and I look forward to voting with him, working with the chairman. We put 24 nominees out before. But some of these nominees are incredible. I think even you recognized it when we had a conversation, yet they got renominated. So we have some real betting issues. So I hope we can get to a better place, because I want you to be staff, but by the same token, I'm just not going to rubber stamp nominees who have some of these problems. And that's why we're having the issue. And if I can get the information that this committee deserves on oversight, Senator Johnson could have Mr. Bullatail.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, let's talk a bit about Russia and Latin America. Last year on the Senate Armed Services Committee, I passed bipartisan legislation adopted as part of the NDAA that required the Defense Intelligence Agency to report on Russia's security cooperation with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. The report that the administration submitted is extensive and it's worrying. It shows that Russia is building a security infrastructure in our backyard with Cuba, with Venezuela, and with Nicaragua. Cuba supports Russian naval operations in exchange for credit and military equipment. In 2018 alone, Russia and Cuba signed a $50 million loan agreement for the purchase of Russian military hardware and replacement parts. In Nicaragua, President Ortega is committed to strengthening security and defense agreements with Russia. And over the past years, hundreds of Russian troops participated in training with the Nicaraguan army. The strongest security partnership, however, that Russia has within Latin America is that of Venezuela. Russia is the regime's largest arms supplier, with upwards of $11 billion in arms sales over the past 2 decades. Just last year, Russia deployed two Tu-160 Blackjack nuclear-capable bombers to the Venezuelan military, along with 10 attack helicopters the previous year. Mr. Secretary, what is your assessment of Russia's strategic objective in its major investments in Latin America?
Sure. Senator, I think your factual recitations are almost spot on, correct, in terms of the analysis that I've seen as well. So this threat is real. They're here in Latin America because they want both proximity. So some of what they do in Cuba, some of what they do in Venezuela gives them access to American Southeast that allows them to operate their ships, their vessels, the aircraft, the 2 bombers that you described. So it gives them logistical hubs. It also gives them space from which to conduct cyber operations. That is, they have access to networks that they can't access from other places in the world. So there is a very real reason for their physical presence in these places. It's why it is so important that the Venezuelan people are successful in overthrowing Maduro, getting their democracy back, and a government that will understand it's in their best interest to have the rule of law and not operate with Cuban and Russian thugs inside of their country.
So Maduro's regime in Venezuela is being in very significant ways propped up by both Russia and Cuba. And indeed, Cuban thugs play an integral part in keeping Maduro in power, even though his regime is illegitimate. In my view, the pivotal piece for whether we have a legitimately elected government in Venezuela is going to be whether the roughly 3,000 generals in the Venezuelan military choose to remain with an illegitimate dictator that is Maduro or instead stand with the legitimate and constitutional leader, Juan Guaido. From the U.S. perspective, I think we should see a combination of sticks and carrots for those military leaders. In other words, each of those generals should know if they stand with Maduro against the Venezuelan people, they face sanctions directly, their families face sanctions directly. That will be a decision to be on the wrong side of history that will haunt them for decades, for their entire lifetime. On the other hand, if they make the decision to stand with the people of Venezuela and with constitutional government, that will be a decision that will benefit them. What are your views on both the carrots and sticks that we can be using, we should be using, and what more can we do?
Senator, I agree with you, and we have done each of those. You should know that Special Representative Abrams and the Chargé Jimmy Story both have lots of traffic from Venezuelan generals looking to see what the bid-offer spread is. So there are many conversations taking place. It's quite interesting from our side to see. We don't think they're telling their buddies that they're having conversations with Americans about the fact that they're trying to figure out if they can get a passport and a free home someplace. So we're confident that this combination of making clear to them, look, it depends exactly where they sit in the command and the actions they take. But there's a set of leaders there that have been part of the Maduro regime. But if they come up to the light, if they come to the right side of Venezuelan history, we're happy not to take any action against them. We're happy to support them continuing to exist inside of Venezuela successfully. But those who don't, we will hold them accountable when the day of reckoning comes and when Maduro leaves and the Venezuelans get the democracy they deserve.
Good. Final question. Shifting to the other part of the world, China. If you look at Huawei, and it is troubling to see our allies and partners, including governments within the Five Eyes intelligence community, consider partnering with Huawei for 5G infrastructure. That raises serious national security concerns for us and our allies. How are your efforts going to make that case to our allies, and what response are you getting?
So we're making real progress. I would hope we would get better responses more quickly, but we've continued to make clear the risks, two risks, right? They have their own risks, risk to their systems, risk to the privacy of their own people. But the second risk is, and certainly if you're a Five Eyes partner, but even if you're outside of Five Eyes, inside of Europe, we still share a great deal of intelligence with you, or co-located or work alongside you. We've made very clear to them, you jeopardize that. We may have to not be able to be there with a DoD system. We may have to not be there with a State Department system because we need to protect our information. So we've made clear moving down that path presents at least two very significant risks, and we've urged them to make a decision that stays away from this technology. There are other alternatives that will deliver them better security and better relationships.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, this morning I had in my office a special immigrant visa recipient from Afghanistan. He had been a translator. He was tortured. He was missing a number of fingers on both hands, almost killed by the Taliban. And he raised a question with me that I couldn't answer. He said, why do we believe we can negotiate with the Taliban today, since we have not been able to do that in past years? And why is the government not at the table for these negotiations? During the time that the negotiations have been ongoing, 7 Americans have been killed by the Taliban. So can you answer his question for me and tell me how we are responding to the Taliban's violence against Americans that has happened during the negotiations? Are they paying any price? Have we asked them for any accountability for what's happened?
Yes, ma'am. I think I can answer his question. His statement that we're not talking to the Afghans is not true. We have extensive daily conversations.
I'm sorry, I mischaracterized that. I should have said that the Afghans aren't at the table for those negotiations.
They are to the extent there are negotiations taking place. They are as part of the table as anybody else. We're talking with the government of national unity. We're speaking with the Taliban. We are working to get the two of them in the room together. We think we're closer than we have been at any time in the last decade in achieving that. This will ultimately be a resolution that the Afghan people will have to achieve. With respect to why we're talking to the Taliban, is they control a significant amount of resources. And to get the reconciliation we need to take down the violence level, the Taliban is going to have a say in that.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I didn't mean to indicate why are we talking to the Taliban. Why do we believe the Taliban will be honest with us any more today than they have been over the last 17 years?
Oh, yes, ma'am. That's a fair question. Trust but verify. It will be about actions on the ground. We understand there's not only a deep level of distrust with the Taliban, there's a deep level of distrust with many of the actors in the Afghan area. It's a nation that has a sad history with respect to truth-telling and corruption. So the Americans, we have our eyes wide open. This will need to be an agreement if we can receive one that gets reconciliation, that takes down the violence levels, but it'll be the actions ultimately. The negotiations will get a framework, but it'll be the actions we see on the ground that will ultimately come to deliver the confidence that we can begin to do what President Trump has directed us to do, is to take down the enormous resource commitment and risk to American soldiers that we face every day.
And what are we doing to ensure that Afghan women are at the table during these negotiations? As you know, we passed the Women, Peace, and Security Act. The President signed it into law that says women should be at the table in conflict-ending negotiations. So
I think Ambassador Khalilzad said this pretty well the other day when he was asked a similar question. We've made some real progress with respect to how women are treated in parts of Afghanistan today.
Without a doubt.
It's been uneven, to be sure. We want to do everything we can to make sure that as Afghanistan moves forward, we don't retrograde, we don't go backwards on that. And so they should be part of the discussion. I think Ambassador Khalilzad said that pretty clearly.
Well, I had a chance to ask the ambassador that myself several weeks ago, and I was not reassured by his response that we have made a firm commitment to ensure that they are part of any negotiation. So I hope you will commit to that today, that that is part of what our effort is in Afghanistan as we're looking at ending this war.
Well, remember, the Afghans will ultimately decide, right? I mean,
No, I appreciate that, but we also have, as we are doing in the negotiations, we are putting pressure on the Afghan government. What I'm asking is that we put pressure on the Afghan government and the Taliban to ensure that women are part of the negotiations.
Senator, there are lots of issues that we're working our way through.
I understand that, but this is half of the population of the country.
Yes, ma'am, and I hope they will make their voices heard. I hope they will turn to their leadership, that they will demand of the folks in there. If they're in Kandahar, they're in Kunduz, if they're in places, I hope the women of Afghanistan will demand that of their leaders and not what we'll do. America, we've always done our part there. America can never be criticized for not doing enough for the Afghan people. I take great umbrage to suggest we're doing anything different. And so I'm urging the Afghan people
and I have done that too. And their response to me has been, we hope that you will also put that kind of pressure on the government.
Yes,
and
ma'am.
that's what I'm asking. It doesn't sound to me like you're willing to commit to that, though.
We're working on every front to make sure that we continue to move forward on every element. We want every woman's voice to be heard. I hope they'll all do that.
And I hope you will, and our government will put pressure on the Taliban and the Afghan government in the same way. So we can agree to leave it at that. I would like to just add one more comment that's a separate matter. I have a constituent who was medically evacuated from China, and through him, our office has been engaged in an effort to better understand what happened to some of the Chinese officials who have been medically evacuated. I understand that there is a report about what happened there. Would you be willing to, would you agree to come before this committee to share with us the information that's in that report?
I'm happy to share everything we've done for every State Department official who we believe has been harmed by the kinds of incidents that you're describing, first in Cuba and then one in China as well that have been confirmed to date.
And that's in part of the report?
Yes, I'm not certain of the exact report. There's been lots of work to do. There have been many reports. I'm certainly happy to share with you what all of the United States government, including the State Department, has done for these officers who have been harmed and some who believe they've been harmed and are still being medically evaluated.
Thank you.
Would we have to do that in a classified setting?
No, sir, not for most of it.
Okay.
There may be some. There may be some that has to be classified in terms of the vectors or the methodology and what we're doing to figure out how these health incidents took place. But the work that the State Department's done to take care of its people, we could certainly talk about.
We've all had a real interest in that for a lot of different reasons. So thank you, Senator Shaheen, for raising that. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thanks, Mr. Secretary, for the testimony. I want to ask you about some testimony yesterday. You were before the Senate Appropriations Committee subcommittee talking about State Department budget, and you had an exchange with Senator Van Hollen about Israel and the potential annexation of the West Bank. I think he asked you questions about if Israel annexes all or a part of the West Bank, what would the U.S. do? And I'm not going to ask you that because that's a little bit of a hypothetical, and there may even be some of that might be above your pay grade. But I want to ask you the question about what U.S. policy is. So tell me what U.S. policy is right now. Would we support an annexation of the West Bank? Do we oppose it, or are we indifferent to whether that happens?
Senator, I'll give you the same answer that I gave yesterday. The United States has had a long-standing policy. We've talked about it. The President's talked about it. We are now working with many parties to share what our vision for as to how to resolve this problem. You, Senator, you would concede that for decades now, there have been all these wonderful experts that have tried to resolve this crisis in the Middle East, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people, and they have each failed. So the old set of ideas aren't worth retreading. They have simply not succeeded. We are hopeful that our vision, our ideas about what this might look like, how we might proceed to do that, will create the conditions where the Israelis and the Palestinians can resolve this. And so I'm not going to get out in front of what's in there, because and this bears upon the very question you're asking. I don't want to get out in front of it, but
do you think two-state solution is an old idea whose time is gone?
It's certainly been an idea that's been around a long time, Senator.
Yeah, but you talked about old ideas that we have to set aside. Is the U.S. policy to set aside the idea of the two-state solution that was at the origin of the United States' recognition of the State of Israel?
I would argue that millions of man-hours have been spent to try and build out a two-state solution. It hasn't worked to date. It may work this afternoon, but it hasn't worked
Is
yet.
that still a goal of the United States, or is that no longer a goal?
Yeah, you can probably ask me 15 other different ways too, Senator. I'm gonna allow this process that we have. We're engaged with parties.
Well, how about if I
work
state
its
it this way?
Yeah.
It has been a policy of the United States. I agree with that. I think it should be the policy. Do you agree with me or disagree with me?
I think ultimately the individuals in the region will sort this out. We want good things for the Palestinian
The
people.
president said at the beginning of his term, he actually said kind of candidly, one state, two state, whatever is agreeable to both Israelis and Palestinians. So let's look at that. Would a solution, in order for the U.S. to accept it, have to be acceptable to Israelis and Palestinians?
You imply that somehow the U.S. has veto rights on a solution that the Israelis and the Palestinians achieve.
So are we indifferent to the decision that's made?
We're going to work with. We want a better life for the people.
I don't
of
think
West
we have
Bank,
a
for
veto right,
Gaza.
but I'm just asking you, do we have a policy? Would you suggest, just using the president's formulation, that if Israelis, and you even said Israelis and Palestinians will have to work it out,
Yeah.
for us to find that acceptable, would both Israelis and Palestinians have to find it acceptable?
Yes, I think for there to be a peaceful resolution here, the Palestinian people are right. We've seen what happens. Right, we've seen intifadas, we've seen protests, we've seen what's happening in Gaza, and I think the Israelis accept the fact that what the ultimate resolution. This will be something that Palestinian people are going to have to acknowledge makes sense.
Then I won't follow up on the hypothetical about whether this administration still accepts the notion of a two-state solution. I'm kind of shocked that cannot be stated clearly. But if your answer is the United States' position is we will accept a resolution, but for that resolution to be acceptable, it has to be accepted by Israelis and Palestinians, I can accept that. Let me ask you this question. I've got two Virginians, one a Virginia resident and one a U.S. citizen, Aziz al-Yusuf and her son Salah al-Haider, who have been imprisoned. I think Aziz al-Yusuf is now out of prison in Saudi Arabia, largely over their activism around women's rights, women's ability to drive, the guardianship issue in Saudi Arabia and efforts to lift that. Tell me the status of any dialogue that you're in with your Saudi counterparts about either these individuals or others who are imprisoned because of activism for women's rights.
So I personally and my team have spoken with the Saudis about every single American who we know to be wrongfully detained, and we've urged them to make a better decision, saying that those folks need to be released, they need to come back. There are too many. It's inconsistent with the relationship between our two countries. We don't think it's in the Saudis' best interest to do this either, but we've made clear our expectation.
And you think Salah al-Haider and Aziz al-Yusuf are wrongfully detained?
If I may not comment on particular cases, I'd prefer to do that.
I assert that they are wrongfully detained, but I can understand your point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Rubio.
Just to follow up on the Israel point, in Israel, I don't think I can recall a time in recent memory where such a state that 9 miles in its narrowest point has faced the array of threats it now faces. It looks north and sees Iranian, Hezbollah elements operating openly just north of its border in Syria. It looks northwest and into Lebanon and see Hezbollah more capable with munitions that are now precision guided. It looks at what's happening in Gaza repeatedly, not just with Hamas, but with other sub-elements who are the ones behind these recent attacks that we've seen over there. It sees Iran continue to advance in its missile capabilities. And on top of all that, it's my observation that, sure, it would be great if we had this solution to this problem with the Palestinians and the Israelis. The problem from Israel's point of view, when you take all of that into context, is every time it has any territory on its border throughout its history has been used to target and to attack Israel. And second, who would they negotiate with? It's not even clear who has the authority or the ability to deliver on a deal at this point. And in fact, some of the deals that are being discussed now are not nearly as generous as deals that have been rejected in the past. So I guess my first question would be, isn't it fair that anything that we do with regards to talking about Israel and talking about solutions to the Palestinian issue take into its context all of these other threats that are currently weighing on it, recognizing that some argue that by dealing with that, these other issues go away. But I mean, it's fair to take all that into consideration.
It's not only fair, it's necessary. Israel has a right to defend itself. It has a right to create a situation on its borders that provides security for it and its people, and I'm very confident the United States will continue to support that.
If tomorrow the issue with the Palestinians were resolved, and it would be great if it were, would it in any way, in your view, lead Iran to be less hostile towards Israel?
Unimaginable.
Would it lead Hezbollah or those elements to be less hostile to Israel?
No chance.
And I believe it's still the case that some of these groups that Israel's being asked to cut a deal with have as their stated objective the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state.
That is true.
I would imagine it is in that vein that that the administration has requested $3.3 billion in security assistance to Israel. And I just want, if I may, to ask you to further comment on it, because one of the interesting things about it is, and I say this, I hope that I'm wrong, but I don't believe that I am, that a future Israel-Hezbollah war, even though neither side seems to want one, certainly at this point, they may wind up in one anyway. In essence, as Israel is forced to defend itself by targeting certain elements, it could trigger a response from Syria, for example, that Israel would have to respond to. It could rapidly escalate. The situation in Gaza could quickly escalate at any moment, particularly if attacks resume inside, for example, suicide attacks in Jerusalem. They will respond to these things very strongly. Any of these responses could rapidly trigger escalation that could lead to a war. So the truth of the matter is that there is a hair-trigger threat that at any moment an open and very severe conflict can open up with any one of these threats that they now face. I imagine that was the thinking behind the administration's commitment on this year's budgeting for security assistance.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We believe that is money well spent for American security in addition to Israel's security. You described the threats that are very real. Almost every one of them is connected to Iran. All right, the risk that Iran will decide to put missile systems inside of Lebanon, that the Israelis will feel compelled because the threat is so enormous they won't have the reaction time. The risk of escalation for these kinds of activities that Iran is engaged in is very, very real.
One last question on the Houthis in Yemen. I've remained concerned that they would acquire from Iran, and I imagine Iran would be the only one that would supply them anti-ship missiles that would allow them to directly threaten not just Saudi shipping, but inadvertently U.S. shipping or perhaps directly as a result. I know there's been a lot of debate here about Yemen and the U.S.'s role in that, but I think lost in that debate has often been the threat that the Houthis in Yemen pose, particularly as they have increasingly become, it seems, surrogates and agents on behalf of the Iranian regime.
The risk is not only the ships at sea, but missile systems inside of Yemen that are Iranian missile systems that land in big cities in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And if they're extended just a little bit into the Emirates, the Gulf states, Americans transit there all the time. You all transit there on trips. These risks to U.S. interests are very, very real. They're not just providing the equipment and hardware either. They're providing the training so that the Houthis can actually use and implement more effectively these weapon systems, UAVs as well. The technology rate that is being transferred from Iran to the Houthis presents a real risk, certainly to Southeast Saudi Arabia, but to the broader Gulf states and America as well.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. For members, a vote was just called. And with that, Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just follow up quickly in regards to the Israel-Palestinian process. The Israel elections are now over. Well, we know they have not yet formed a new government, but the speculation is that will occur rather rapidly. There was also comment in one of this morning's paper that the United States may be putting forward a peace proposal in regards to the Palestinians and the Israelis. Can you just, particularly in response to Senator Kane's point about the United States not having veto right, can we anticipate that the United States will be initiating a peace offer in the near future, or parameter in the near future?
So we've been working on a set of ideas that we hope to present before too long, that will, I hope, have sufficient force of intellect and power that the Israelis, the Palestinians will see that there's value there. There'll be things that neither of them like, but things that the Gulf states think make sense. All those who have an interest in resolving this conflict will think makes sense. I'm sure there'll be critiques of it as well, but we hope that it provides the intellectual grist, a foundation upon which these discussions can advance in a way that they haven't been able to do for the past several years.
Well, it seems like over the last umpteen years, there's never been the right time to move forward with peace, and peace must move forward. So I just would encourage the United States to not give up on peace between the Palestinians and Israelis. It's critical not only for Israel and the Palestinians, but for that region and for the future of that region. I want to get back to the human rights agenda, and I really am trying to find ways we work together on advancing the human rights and American values. And the Global Magnitsky is one of those efforts that was a strong bipartisan, just about a unanimous effort here in the United States Congress to give an additional tool for the U.S. to lead against human rights violators by making it clear we don't want you in our country and we don't want you to use the banking system. And we have found many of our allies around the world have pattern laws very similar to Global Magnitsky, and others are considering it. So we already had an exchange that relates to this, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but the Uyghur issue with China is another area that we've triggered interest on using Magnitsky sanctions against the Chinese on a clear violation of international standards. And I guess my point is this: the Magnitsky law was focused initially on Russia. It's now global, and we want to use it as a global tool to show that America is concerned about human rights globally. Can you just advise us as to whether this is being actively considered in China in regards to the Uyghur issues in other areas?
Senator, we're considering using this global authority in many places, including Asia, including China.
Well, I appreciate that.
We're trying to find the right fact pattern, the right place, and that's what we've done every place in my now almost year as Secretary of State. And Treasury as well.
And the purpose of Magnitsky law was to have Congress working with the administration. It's not supposed to be in competition. And you have used it. The administration has used it in many cases that have been very much in consultation with us. I would just urge us to get a closer relationship in regards to how you implement the Global Magnitsky. Let me tell you one other area, and I believe Senator Udall may have questioned on this, and that is arms sales. We're not naive to think we're not going to have arms sales with countries that don't share our total belief in governance. We understand that. But we expect arms sales to advance U.S. values, democratic values. Can you just assure us that as you look at arms sales, that we use that as a way not only for the military issues and defense, but also to advance American values in the country we're doing business with, to let them know it's absolutely essential that these arms be used consistent with American values?
So we certainly do that. Indeed, when recommendations come up, as we discuss arms sales, discuss them with both the other elements of the United States government as well as the legislative branch. So that's always a component of how we think about it. Indeed, there are arms sales that we've not proposed because we looked at it and said it doesn't make sense, certainly at this time, given what's going on in that country with respect to human rights or extrajudicial killings. We certainly take a close look at those as a component of whether we think a particular arms transfer makes sense.
And I would suggest, again, here's an area where Congress, this committee particularly, wants to work with you to make it clear that it's not how the administration feels or Congress feels, it's how we feel advancing U.S. values in our bilateral relations, including arms sales. Last point, if I might, in regards to Burma, and I know that question was asked by Senator Gardner, the Holocaust Museum has determined there's compelling evidence that it was ethnic cleansing. I would just ask if you could share with us how we are responding to the genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, issues that have taken place. We can never let an episode like this go without the United States weighing in very directly and very openly as to how this cannot be tolerated and that those responsible need to be held accountable.
So I think this administration has clearly done that in Burma. We're continuing to do it. I had a conversation just yesterday on this very issue. We're looking at, are there other sanctions, are there other tools that we have where we can go after other military leaders that engaged in inappropriate behavior inside of the country. I met with the leadership of Bangladesh earlier this week or end of last week talking about the difficult conditions that these refugees are in there, how we can help as the season for monsoons once again is upon us. It's going to be a long process to get them returned. And so we all have to be mindful of making sure that there's the resources there. We have not forgotten what's taken place in Burma.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you made earlier reference to Chin Kwang Guo, who was the oppressor of the Tibetan people, and now he's moved over to a new job, which is to oppress the Uyghur. And same guy, same attitude towards minorities inside of China. Your administration has yet to sanction Chin Kwang Guo. Are you intending on doing that?
We're constantly evaluating appropriate sanctions. You're right, he got a promotion.
He got a promotion. Yeah, it's a promotion in repression responsibility, however. So
we take this threat incredibly seriously. We've called this out in ways that the previous administration refused to do. I'm proud of the work we've done on human rights around the world, and including what we're doing in China.
Yeah, but you have yet to sanction this guy who is in charge of the repression. So are you going to charge him? Are you going to sanction him, particularly so that the whole world knows that we are holding this man responsible for the harm which he is doing to human rights of the Uyghur?
I've made a pretty consistent practice not to announce sanctions at Senate hearings.
All right. Well, let me move over to Burma, where your administration has yet to sanction the commander-in-chief of the Burmese military, who is also responsible in that country for the repression of the Rohingya, which is an ongoing crime against humanity. So are you going to sanction the commander-in-chief of the Burmese military for his activity in harming the Rohingya?
Senator, our diplomatic team is confronted with very complex issues in Burma. We're trying to do our best to figure out which tools to use in which places, how to shape the situation. Our goal, obviously, I think you would agree with me, our goal isn't to sanction people, but to get change behavior and then to hold those responsible for the acts that took place accountable. And our team, both in theater and here in Washington that works on these issues, is constantly evaluating the right tool mix.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, Mr. Secretary, that it is complicated, but at the same time, I think it's very clear. I think it's very clear that there is a genocide. There is a crime against humanity which is being committed. And the United States has a responsibility to be the moral leader of the world. And here we actually know the military leader, the commander-in-chief who was responsible for this crime. And we expect you to do something about it, Mr. Secretary. We expect you to sanction him in the same way we expect you to sanction the leader in China who has been designated to oppress the Uyghur in their country. Let me move over, if I could, for a second, following up on Senator Kane's questioning, and that's with regard to the Saudi nuclear program and the recent revelation that it does have a nuclear power plant, but it's not under International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards, which is a lot different than the program inside of Iran. And what I'm concerned about, and Senator Kane has already made reference to this, is the non-public 810 authorizations for companies to pursue nuclear cooperation with Saudi Arabia. And I have repeatedly asked whether 810 authorizations have been granted, and to see them, I've received silence with a dash of obfuscation from your administration. And I recall that you yourself, over in the House, you passionately spoke about secret side deals and how much you were opposed to them when you were a House member. So will you commit to sharing the applications and the authorizations you have granted for companies to pursue nuclear cooperation with Saudi Arabia?
Senator, I remain passionate about the important oversight that both the Senate and the House engage in. I think it's incredibly important to keep the executive branch acting consistent with the laws that this Congress or previous ones have passed. Let me take your request under consideration. I can't make that consideration today. There are other agencies that have a voice in this as well, but I'm happy to get an answer to you about whether we can provide it, and if so, when.
I think it's important for you to be transparent, and towards that goal, I am going to introduce legislation with Senator Rubio and Senator Kaine and Senator Young later on today to mandate those disclosures. There's a bipartisan concern on this committee that we don't have enough information about these potential nuclear deals between the United States and Saudi Arabia in an already volatile area of the world. Again, the Sunni-Shia tension is already at a fever pitch. Adding this nuclear dimension to it will only make it worse. So I think it's important for us to be in on the ground floor or whatever planning you have for the transfer of nuclear material to Saudi Arabia, and transparency is key. We are the Oversight Committee, and we have to make sure that we're working to make sure these countries live together and understand each other and not try to put together programs that will wind up annihilating each other. So I thank you for any information which you can give us, because the Middle East is about to get a lot hotter, and I'm not talking about climate change. If Saudi is allowed to continue down the pathway with ballistic missiles, with nuclear materials, that will only exacerbate and not reduce the tension in the region. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With that, thank you, Secretary Pompeo. This is, we appreciate your patience, and I know you agree with us that these spirited discussions are really important for development and carrying on of diplomacy by the United States. We're all Americans. We all have the same goals. How we get there, sometimes we disagree on, but it's important that we continue these lines of communication, keep them open both in open session and privately. And you've been very kind to me in that regard personally, and I sincerely appreciate that. In any event, for the information of the members, the record will remain open until close of business on Friday. And we'd ask the witness to respond as promptly as possible, and your responses will be made part of the record. With the thanks of the committee, Mr. Secretary, this hearing is adjourned.